Okay, I know in a minute, I'm gonna do a whole welcome, but can we talk for a second to my team? Did you just play Teenage Wasteland as my walk-on music at 8:30 in the morning? Okay, we'll have a whole talk about that later. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, thank you for being here. Some of your peers are not here yet. We are assuming that is because maybe our error was 8:30 might not be the best time for graduate students, so we may have to learn about this. So I'm Suzanne Clark. I'm the Senior Executive Vice President at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And one of the things that means is I get to welcome people to things, which is really kind of a cool job, especially when you're doing that for an event that we're so proud of and excited to do. And I'll get into why we're excited about it in just a second, but I just want to ask a quick question. We know we have people here from Georgetown, yes? Okay. And American, okay, and George Mason, I met one, Howard, excellent, Johns Hopkins, okay, well, obviously you're the closest, Maryland, and I forget if there was anybody here from Georgetown. I'm a double Hoya, so I like to double Georgetown everything. That's kind of my thing. I can't help it. But we're doing such a cool new partnership with Howard, which I don't have time to talk about yet, but I'm going to come corner you in the back of the room about it. And so next year at this summit, I hope I get to say Howard twice. That's my goal. Anyway, we're really glad that you're here. How many of you are here for the case competition? Oh, not many. That's great. That's actually great, because we were hoping to get some new faces, so it's wonderful. Okay, so my job is to tell you a little bit about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is not the government. We are, in fact, the largest trade association and the largest lobbying spender in the country. We represent all sizes, all sectors, all industries, but we have a unifying mission, which is to help businesses create jobs and stimulate economic growth. And why do we think that? Why is that important to us? Because we believe that when business thrives, communities thrive, and families thrive. For us, it's all about opportunity. And if you take one thing away from today, I want you to know how strongly we feel that your profession, what you are pursuing, is a noble calling. It is a noble calling because what you will do is provide opportunities for your families, for your communities, and for this country. In fact, I like to laugh all the time about all of your friends with these really elegant degrees, you know, the ones that are studying, I don't know, fine arts and languages and things that just seem very elegant, you know, and I want you to remember something. They are counting on you to fund all of that work, okay? All of it. It's a really important thing to study, and it's an important thing to study. Business is an important thing to study because everything that takes in money and gives out money is a business. And everything that you're studying and learning how to do will benefit you, whether you're running your family finances, whether you want to farm, whether you want to run a charity. Think about where charities always get into trouble. It's always over accounting, right? It's always over some business side thing that the people with the great mission calling didn't know how to do. You're learning how to run a business and all of the things that impact a P&L. And so when I was getting my MBA at Georgetown, I remember that we took all these classes and we thought that the classes that were really going to impact our career were all the quant classes or, you know, strategy or finance. It turned out that what really impacted our careers the most was all the people stuff, all the organizational behavior stuff, which is a whole other conference for a whole other day. But I also remember that even though I got my MBA at Georgetown, where I'm really proud alum and I'm still involved in the school, we didn't study that much about government. I mean, I think it was like one mini class jammed in someplace, right? And that's weird, given that where we live and what the industry of this region really is dominated by, right? Like, even if you look at the really big companies that are located here, the defense companies or the big IT companies, they're all government contractors, right? And so really understanding how the government works is important if you're gonna be a business leader, particularly if you're gonna be a business leader in this region, but I'm about to make the argument that it's true no matter where you live, no matter what you're gonna do. Government has a huge impact, right? You wanna protect your patent? You wanna get your merger approved? You're worried about tariffs? We're going to announce a new round of tariffs today. A whole bunch of companies have a cell in their Excel spreadsheet that is massively changing today, and they don't know what it is, okay? So that's nice uncertainty if you're trying to run a business. The regulations, the taxes, they all have big impacts on your P&L. So it's really important that you understand that when you're running businesses now, as I know some of you are, or later in your career. In addition to that, particularly your generation, even more than mine, is demanding more from businesses. So your customers are going to demand that you get it right for different reasons. But for the reasons I just discussed, your board's going to demand that you get it right. You know, the great example, and you'll hear about some of this today, were the tech companies who in the beginning were a little bit too cool for school and didn't think they needed to be here and didn't think that they needed to engage and thought they could do it their own way. We've all seen the recent headlines. So when we're doing government affairs, what does it mean to us? What it means isn't just lobbying the way you might think about it. You know, somebody on the Hill buying a congressman a steak, you know, or shaking hands or something you've seen in the movies, right? This building is filled with hundreds of experts who have deep understanding of all kinds of issues, who can be resources to government officials at all levels. So it's deep policy. It's litigation. When government gets it wrong, we're people who will go sue them and say you overreached. You did not have the authority to do that. It's research, it's relationships, it's deep and long relationships and trust. It's state work, grassroots, being out there in the country, finding out what people really need, and really using that information and those relationships to impact things back here in Washington. You're going to hear a lot of examples today, but let's just take a quick one on tax reform. We were operating at one of the highest corporate rates in the developed world. So if you think about at that exact same time, people are complaining about US companies moving offshore, moving jobs offshore, but we were creating an uncompetitive environment here. So we suddenly had a moment where we thought we could get reform done, and the US Chamber of Commerce spent a lot of last year working on that. What did that mean? It meant advertising campaigns. It meant digital. It meant TV. It meant radio in key districts. We did more than 500 meetings with members of Congress, 300 in the districts. Letters to Congress signed by hundreds of local chambers, our partners. And we activated hundreds of thousands of Americans to figure out what was important to them and go talk to their congressmen. It was a big media strategy, a big research strategy. And we got it done. It's a small window. And all of that activity in this short amount of time shouldn't discount the years of work that went into really understanding the economics, really understanding what it meant to a family, to a community, to a business, how it's all interconnected. And we believe that business won. We believe that communities won, that families won, that America won. And I'm seeing it. You know, I'm on 2 public company boards, and yesterday we had a call, a pre-earnings release call. The CFO is running through a number, and somebody said, why is the such and such a number declining from here to here? And they said, well, that first number was so impacted by tax reform this year. I mean, it's an exact line item in these P&Ls. And you've seen in the news what some of these companies are doing with that, either bonuses, raises. I was with Kroger the other day. They're doing a huge skills workshop and developing them in communities around the country. It's really remarkable. Anyway, I'm really impressed that you're here. I think you're investing in your career by being here so early. Again, I think when you're taking your MBA, it's so important that you think about the non-traditional things that are going to impact your career and your business, right? So this could be a serious strategic differentiator for you as a person. So if you're thinking about marketing your personal brand after you graduate or when you're interviewing, and you think about all the things you're going to say you know and say you do, if you're planning on staying in this region, this piece, this government affairs piece, is a really good thing. To understand, to say you know, whether you're managing it or aware of it or investing in it or practicing it, it's a really key part. So we're glad you're here. We hope this will be a great day for you, and we appreciate so much that you would be with us. So I'm going to introduce you to our next speaker, who is our Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer. He spent 11 years working for senior members of the House. He was the Deputy Chief of Staff for 2 majority leaders, where he oversaw a great deal of policy formulation. After that, he had his own research and analysis firm that focused on public policy. He is also a Hoya. And he's also my friend. So please welcome Neil Bradley.
Well, thank you. Good morning. Where are the Hoyas? All right. Suzanne's a double Hoya. I'm a single Hoya, but a Hoya is still a Hoya. Well, thank you all for being with us this morning. We are so proud here at the Chamber to be able to host this event, and we think it's the beginning of a beautiful initiative in conjunction with you and your schools as we bring business and government together. Part of my topic this morning is government relations. And what is government relations? There's a tendency to think of government relations as a 20th century invention, that when the Republic was founded, we didn't have all these government relations specialists, and that may be true, but the reality is, and the truth is that government relations is as old as the Republic. In fact, it's enshrined in our Constitution. We spend a lot of time talking about the First Amendment and religious freedom and freedom of the press. Sometimes we forget to read all the way to the end, and where it tells us that we have the right to petition our government for a redress of grievances. And that in and of itself is the basis of government relations. Now, truth be told, 200 years ago, this took the form of petitions, literal petitions. The right to petition government was the right to send a petition to Congress. And Americans, by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, wrote their members of Congress and submitted petitions, which were entered into the journals of the House and the Senate for their consideration. Today, petitioning in our government looks a lot different. We do it as individuals when we call our member of Congress or when we send an email or a letter, but we also do it collectively. And the right to petition our government is, in fact, a collective right that we exercise. And we're able to exercise it whenever we get together and we form a group, whether that group is a group designed to protest something the government's doing, or a trade association designed to advance our interests, or even a company that we believe we have economic interest in and ownership. We do it collectively when we form a union. All of these things are ways in which we come together and collectively exercise that right of petitioning in our government and engage in government advocacy. Together, this forms what I like to call the advocacy ecosystem. And the derisive term for this is K Street. Everyone likes to talk about all the lobbyists wearing Gucci loafers on K Street. The reality is you can probably go down to K Street and find some lobbyists, and maybe you'll find 1 or 2 wearing Gucci loafers. But the vast majority of lobbyists in Washington, the vast majority of government affairs, advocates, and executives work in these areas. Maybe they work for a company and they're the in-house lobbyist. They work for an association like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, like I do. Maybe they're a contract lobbyist, the classic K Street, where they work for a variety of different companies and groups and associations, helping them navigate Washington and Congress and the federal agencies. They're unions. Unions are advocacy groups and lobbyists. Also think tanks. This town is full of think tanks from the far left to the far right, some occupying the center, all of whom are trying to advocate their point of view and shape government policy. They're also nonprofits. I went and pulled some of the most recent data, and by the way, there's lots of data on lobbying, and this is just a little logo picture of some of those who are most engaged, most actively engaged in lobbying over the last year. You'll notice that it's not all companies. There's a fair number of companies there, but about half of it is associations like the Chamber, or associations like the Realtors, which don't have big corporate membership, but literally represent the thousands of individual realtors that we all use when we buy our house. Notice a few other things on here. AARP AARP is traditionally one of the largest investors in government relations and advocacy. They're not a company. They represent seniors, and they have a definite point of view. George Soros and the Open Society Institute actually made the list for the first time this year. They have a definite point of view about where government policy wants to go, and they're part of this advocacy ecosystem. So if all these folks are lobbying, what are they doing? And hopefully, did they explain to you the voting we're going to have today and some of the quizzes? Yes? No? Well, this may not go well if we didn't explain it. Let me take a moment and do that. If you pull out your phones, all right, I'll pull out my phone too. Get your phone, text MBA Summit to 22333, and you're able to join. And we'll have some questions throughout the day that you can help us answer. The first question up today is, what's lobbying activity? Or more specifically, in this instance, what isn't a lobbying activity? Giving testimony before a committee of Congress, sending comments to a federal agency, emailing a member of Congress asking for a meeting. What do you all think? You think all of those above constitute lobbying activities, or none of the above? All right. That's exactly what I would have said too. All of the above. Turns out we're wrong. Lobbying activities have a very broad definition in federal law and regulation, but they actually exclude all of the things that were just listed there. The ability to go up and testify before a committee, to send your thoughts and views to an agency on a proposed regulation, or even just ask for a meeting, technically don't constitute lobbying. So what does constitute lobbying? It literally is the act of being paid to engage with policymakers in an attempt to effectuate or comment on that public policy. So as an individual, if you go up and you contact your member of Congress and you tell them, I really hate H.R. 123, you're not a lobbyist. But if you're me and you're paid to do that, and you go up and say, we really hate H.R. 123, that's a lobbying activity. So what's all this lobbying activity look like in Washington? How many people are doing that? How many people get paid to go up and talk to members of Congress or agency officials? Turns out, most recent data, 11,502 individuals who are paid to go do that. They also keep track of how much money is spent to do all this, $3.36 billion in the last year. Does that sound like a lot of money? Does it? Yes? No? It does sound like a lot of money. Anything that starts with a B and billion sounds like a lot of money. But let me put it in context. The same year, Procter & Gamble spent 25% more to try to get you to buy their version of toilet paper and toothpaste. The same year, AT&T spent that same amount trying to get you to use their telecommunication services. General Motors spent that exact same amount trying to get you into a GM automobile that year. In respect of what we think about trying to move the public and move advocacy, it's really kind of small potatoes in the grand scheme of things. But why do those folks spend this money? Why are they engaged in lobbying? How many folks have seen Schoolhouse Rock? Have you seen I'm Just a Bill on Capitol Hill? This was one of my favorites when I was a kid. I always loved government. And the idea of the little Bill who just wants to become a law, and he's sitting in committee, and he can't get a vote, and he goes out and he sits out on the Capitol steps, and he's just a Bill sitting on Capitol Hill. Well, it turns out, as you all know, it really doesn't work that way. The legislative process is complicated. It's messy. In fact, a lot of bills never even get a vote, never even get a hearing. Some bills don't have a hearing, don't have a vote, but somehow become law. The process doesn't work like we were taught in civics. It's messy, it's complicated, but it has huge consequences, which is a lot of what we're here to talk about today. But before we get to those consequences, let's put it in context of how big this is. This is, each Congress is 2 years. This is the last, I think, 6 or 7 Congresses. On average, about 350 bills become law. There's votes on another couple 200 bills. 10,000 to 11,000 bills get introduced every every year by our 535 members of Congress. Every one of those has the potential to move markets. And you're going to hear from our next guest in a minute about how that happens. Whether a bill becomes law and changes how businesses operate, as Suzanne just talked about, or the threat of a bill becoming law depresses a stock price or raises a stock price, or even the threat of a bill just being introduced. But legislation is actually small potatoes. Regulations actually dwarf what happens in legislation. Every year, federal agencies all around this city finalize about 3,500 regulations that cover everything from the price for health care services to the price of milk to your workplace rules to flying standards to autonomous vehicles. They have the force of law. Now you think, okay, 3,500, we could take care of that. They run about 25,000 to 30,000 pages a year. That's a lot of stuff for people to keep track of, and it takes a lot of paid professionals to do it. I think we're trying to bring up our next question should be coming up here. So one thought that you hear, particularly if you follow politics, is this sounds a lot like a swamp, right? DC's the swamp. It's either the swamp or the wild, wild west. All these lobbyists who are trying to influence those regulations or trying to influence those bills, they're out whining and dining members of Congress. They're using everything they can to get their influence done. So it turns out the reality is a lot different. There's a lot of rules. These are some of the rules regarding what is acceptable for a lobbyist to give to a congressional staffer. I used to be a congressional staffer. I used to have to abide by these rules. Tickets to a Washington Nationals game in the nosebleed seats. Food at a reception, but only if it can be eaten by a toothpick. A home-cooked meal for your next-door neighbor, if you're a lobbyist and your new next-door neighbor is a staffer, or all of the above would be acceptable. I hate this answer, by the way. It's really stupid. Turns out the only correct answer there is B. Food you can eat with a toothpick. That's the rule for what a lobbyist can give a congressional staffer. It is absolutely true, I can tell you this from experience, that if you're a lobbyist and you have a new next-door neighbor who moves in who's a congressional staffer, and you want to be a good neighbor and you want to bring over some home-cooked cookies for your new neighbor, that's against the law. So it's not the wild, wild west. In some cases, like everything else, the regulations have gone a bit too far. But regulations aren't the only aspect of it. There's also disclosure. Louis Brandeis said the greatest sunshine's the greatest disinfectant. That's true here too. If you want to go to Open Secrets or the Lobbying Disclosure Database and you want to look up my name, you will conveniently find a 63-page report that tells you every issue that I advocated on behalf of the U.S. Chamber and our members for in the last year. You can see it all. Now, why does it take a 63-page report to tell you all that? And it's good that, by the way, that you can figure that out and you can see what the Chamber's up to. We're engaged on, and by the way, that thing you can't read is all the issues that we engaged on. And underneath those, if you go into the report, are all the bill numbers, all the particular policies. Why did we engage on all that many issues? Because for our members, some of those issues are life or death. It's the difference between having a business that's profitable and one that's going to be shut down by a new government law or regulation. It's also the difference between an economy that's growing and prosperous or one that's stagnant and falling. And to help us understand a little bit more about how that's the case, I want to welcome to the stage my friend and our next guest, Dan Clifton. Let me tell you a little bit about Dan. Dan and I go back, let me give you the clicker there. Dan and I go back 15 years, maybe longer, in Washington. He is an old Washington hand, but he is currently a partner and the head of policy research at Strategas Partners. He himself and his firm are a top-ranked analyst on Wall Street, particularly when it comes to finance and tax questions. If he looks familiar to you, that probably means you watch CNBC or Fox Business, and you've seen him frequently on one of those two programs. He got his start in politics and government in New Jersey, which, by the way, is a great place to get your start. It is rough and tumble, and if you can hold your own there, you can hold your own anywhere. He's considered an expert by many in this town, but I just want to brag on him a little bit by saying what Larry Kudlow, the president's new national economic advisor, said about 3 or 4 weeks ago when Larry Kudlow himself was on CNBC. Larry Kudlow finished his segment by calling Dan Clifton simply the smartest policy guy in D.C. And that's absolutely true, and you're going to see a little bit of why that's true today. So Dan, welcome.
Thank you for that introduction, but you know how I feel. You are the smartest policy guy in D.C.
We'll skip the mutual affection, but tell us a little bit about Strategas and what you do.
Sure. So Strategas is an investment research firm, and it's also an asset management firm. So let me take the first side of the business, really the core of the business. We provide investment research to institutional investors. Those could be mutual funds, state and local pension funds, private equity firms, and U.S. corporations as well, and trying to decipher where global financial markets are going, where the global economy is headed, and in addition, what I do personally is try and understand what's happening here in Washington and how that could impact financial markets. And over time, what's going on here in Washington has become increasingly more important to the global financial markets and to the global economy and to companies specifically. And it really just takes a lot of the different experience of understanding how campaigns work, understanding how policy works, understanding how lobbying works, and being able to integrate that with economic and financial forecast. Our firm is based in New York. We have about 55 employees, and there's 3 of us here in Washington, D.C., trying to figure out this daily show of what goes on here every day.
That's a lot for 3 people to try to take on. Tell us a little bit about, we talked about in the last segment, government relations and what that looks like. Why is it that businesses would engage in government relations?
Sure. I just want to show you a slide real quick, and I'm going to explain what these 2 charts are. But first, what we are seeing from U.S. companies is they are increasingly citing the government as a bigger portion of their business. Now, this doesn't have to be a negative comment or a positive comment, but just an awareness of what is happening on the government side is becoming increasingly important to U.S. companies. Let's say you go out and get a job at a very prominent company, and you have a knowledge and experience of what's happening in Washington. I think you're going to have an edge over your peers, given where corporations are thinking. And by the way, it wasn't always this case, but really starting around 2001, 2002, we started to see companies paying more attention to Washington. We obviously had 9/11. And the ability to keep us safe. So money laundering rules, which is something that you don't hear a lot about, became very important to a lot of companies. Cybersecurity and general security issues became very important. Those affect all companies. But at the same time that was happening, we also had something called corporate scandals, Enron, WorldCom, and that led to these new rules, which was called Sarbanes-Oxley. And it affected every single company in America. And that really began this transition where companies knew they had to follow what was going on in Washington and really start to see it was having an impact on their business. Now, when we got to the financial crisis in 2008, it only accelerated further. And what this first chart shows you with the red is companies are now disclosing and mandated to disclose all of their risks to their business on what's called a 10K form. At Strategas, we go through those 10K forms and try and understand what's driving business. And what we see is that businesses are citing government as its highest risk more. 63% companies cite government as a higher risk today than they did in 2008. And you've seen a 7-fold increase in the number of words being dedicated to that government risk since 2005. So overall, the government is having a much bigger impact in terms of how companies are thinking about their business overall. And again, I don't think it's a bad thing. From a sector basis, obviously some sectors are going to have a greater concentration. If you're in the healthcare industry, obviously the government's going to have a bigger presence. and it works its way down. If you're a defense company, you're going to be more involved. What's interesting to us, and I highlight it in red just because of the events of this week, is that technology had cited the government as the lowest risk of any sector. And I think that pendulum is beginning to swing with the change in administration and the way that they look at some of these tech companies. And you saw it with Facebook, Amazon. I mean, Amazon's a great company. And I just want to bring it back to one other point. Bill Gates is very famous for saying, I just want to operate my software. And eventually he had an antitrust suit. And our thesis at Strategas is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, because somebody else will be coming after you as a way to try and gain competition. I don't mean to be so crude about it, but you have to have that seat at the table. And a lot of companies may not be lobbying on something, but they want to have open communications with congressional staff, with administration staff, to inform them how they're providing value to customers, consumers, investors, so that if something does happen, they have that open line of communication.
I assume the worst position in the world to be in is to have no government relations,
Correct.
no exposure in Washington,
Yes.
and then some event happens,
Correct.
and the next day Washington is about to regulate you,
Yes.
put your business out of existence, and you know no one. Is that what companies are responding to and preparing for?
Absolutely, Neil. And let me say, even if you have a small government affairs, I'll give you two examples. I'm not going to name companies, but let's say there's a biotech company, it's a mid-sized biotech company, and they have 5 lines of drugs that they use, AIDS and hepatitis C. And then I have a small biotech company that's only dealing with cystic fibrosis right now, and they're really making people's lives better with cystic fibrosis. It's that company, that the smaller company, that is aggressively out in Washington every day informing Congress about what they are doing to make Americans live better, more productive, and there's a high cost to their drug. There's no doubt about it. But if the Drug Pricing Act swings, then they're going to be prepared to talk about how they shouldn't be included in some sort of price control. Now let's take the other side of it. I love my job. I have the best job in the world. Neil's got a pretty good job too. But if a biotech company said to me, we want you to run our government affairs because we have cured a very significant disease, and your job is to go tell members of Congress that not only have we cured something, but at the same time, we're going to save Medicare hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars, by replacing kidney and liver, by not having to do kidney and liver transplants. That would be a dream job. And in reality, that happened, and the government affairs strategy was not executed, and they walked away as the devil for charging high drug prices, even though they saved this country hundreds of billions of dollars.
Hepatitis C.
Hepatitis C drug.
Yes.
And this happened in 2013, and we're having a big debate about drug pricing right now. Really, it was about that life-saving drug that has wiped out hepatitis C, and it was a one-time price pop in the drug. And that's because there were the end users were arguing, the hospitals and the managed care companies were arguing, they're destroying our business.
So we've talked a little bit about the risk
Yep.
from government. Is
Yep.
there potential upside?
Absolutely, right? So when I use the word risk, I'm using it as risk management rather than negative. But there's clearly an upside. And I just want to show you this chart. This is a study from an academic at the Boston University. His name's James Beeson. This came out in May of 2016, right as Donald Trump was singing about the swamp. But what this chart shows you is where company profits are coming from. The blue is research and development, right? And everything other than the red is non-government factors. And really, up to 2000, businesses made money on market conditions. And what we're starting to see with that red, really since 2000, is an increasing portion of profits are coming from Washington. Now, we talk about the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act basically put a lot of new money into providing health care. So an increasing portion of the healthcare sector's profits are coming now from Washington overall, and they're a vital partner with the government. So you have to be at the table and engaging so that you're providing services to the government overall. And I can go through any sector and give you examples of where it is a very proactive part of this business. So there are really 3. Defensive, like you mentioned, when there's a problem. Offensive, to be able to provide services to new citizens better. And then your risk management strategy of just having an open line of communication and being able to discuss their business lines with members of Congress. Now, in my life, I worked in government. I worked in New Jersey governor's office. I worked as a lobbyist. I worked as a nonprofit. Everything you said about how Washington works, I've done. The one I wish I did was Congress, and I never really had the chance to do that, but I did work in the state legislature. And what I would tell you is when I worked in the governor's office, I literally would park my car. This is all pre-9/11. I'd park my car in the parking director, and on Monday and Thursday session days, the lobbyists would literally be waiting for me to park my car and then talk to me. And you would think that's a bad thing, okay? But literally, the best information I got in my job were from the lobbyist. And when I went into that job, I thought they were bad people, and I all thought that they were rent-seeking and trying to get something from me. And every industry has bad actors, but I'll tell you this. The most honest people I met were lobbyists, because they would come in and they would say to me, here's what we're trying to do, here's where the landmines are, here's where the pushback is, so that my boss, the governor, would not get caught off guard in the decision-making process. And I was pleasantly surprised by how that process worked, and that's why companies really have to be at the table in building those relationships.
Yeah.
So.
That's an important point, right? The lobbyists have to have long relationships, right?
Yep.
So I'm going to walk in and pull the wool over your eyes today to get something from government. Probably is a pretty short-sighted strategy.
Exactly. I would totally agree with that. This is the long game. And when I lobbied, by the way, I worked for a nonprofit. I worked for Americans for Tax Reform, and I ran a subsidiary off that, the American Shareholders Association. You mentioned the ARP. I was trying to create the ARP for individual shareholders, okay? And when I did it, 90% of the work I did was facilitating information that I was picking up to other congressional staff, making it better for them to do their job, communicating with my membership in their district to those members of Congress. I was doing that 90% of the time. The 10% of the time was, hey, I need you to sign on to this bill, and this is why it would be a good bill. It was more about helping and taking that long game strategy. And I think that's the way the system really does operate overall, and is beneficial to members of Congress and their staff.
So you've talked a little bit about the risks. You've talked a little bit about the upside and how much of this is driven by government. One of the things about this school is metrics and quantifiable.
Sure.
This is an academic study.
Yep.
And, academics do a nice job sometimes quantifying things.
Yep.
Is it possible to quantify any of this in the real world?
Absolutely. So I mentioned before there's two parts of our business. The first part of our business is research. The second part is asset management, where I actually manage money for institutional investors. My fund is built to directly capitalize on what's going on here in Washington, because investors have failed to recognize this growing trend of Washington being more important. And let me just give you one anecdotal example. My colleague, Courtney, who I hired out of the University of Kentucky 4 years ago, she was a straight finance and economics major. And my point to her was, you can go into the money management business and pick stocks bottom up, here's their cash flow, here's their profits, or you can come to Washington, you can learn how Washington impacts all these companies' profits in different ways, how a bill can get introduced and wipe a company out, right? And when you have that skill, you'll be able to rise up much faster in the money management business overall. And now she's a better policy analyst than I am, right? You know, the irony of all that. But she has the skills and has been able to incorporate it in. 2008, during the financial crisis, our thesis was that Washington was going to have a greater impact over financial markets. In hindsight, that didn't look very smart, but it worked at the time. And we started to measure different metrics on stock performance. And what we found was that on individual stocks, no political variable really worked. But as a basket of stocks, we really started to see a strong correlation building, and that was based on lobbying. And what we have found is that companies that spend more on lobbying, not just in aggregate dollars, but really getting to several factors in size, begin to outperform the market. At first, we didn't realize why that was happening, but basically companies come in, they lobby, they're doing something good, they're doing something bad. The market cannot price that earnings benefit. Second is that companies know their risks and opportunities faster than investors do. So our proprietary quantitative formula picks that up. Since we've been running this fund in 2009, we've outperformed the S&P 500 by 500 basis points per year. That's about 5% per year. And if you're familiar with the investment world, there's a big debate about active versus passive, where S&P index funds are outperforming the active managers. We flipped that upside down, and in fact, we actually believe the reason why large cap managers are underperforming their benchmark is because those active managers have failed to account for what's happening in Washington and be able to quantify those earnings. And we figured out how to do it. I just want to give you one sub-example, which is this bar chart here. What you see are blue lines and you see red lines. Those are the largest mergers over the last 5 years. The blue line represents the companies that actually made an investment in the merger and acquisition process and lobbying and getting their deal through based on our proprietary score. The red were much lower in our proprietary score, and there's a very dividing line. If you make a certain level of investment, you're going to get your deal approved, and if you don't make that investment, your deal is going to get rejected. So Time Warner, AT&T, they didn't make that investment. Monsanto got approved last week or earlier this week. They made that investment. And again, I'm a big capitalist. I believe in free markets. But when the regulators had a problem with Monsanto's and Bayer's deal, those regulators, they were at the table to make the deal and make those final concessions because they were at the table. This stuff really matters as you go into the business world. And just, my advice is learning the Washington process as you go into the business field, I think is critical for you to be able to rise up in those organizations later on, because this is really where our industry is headed.
And if you can go to your boss in the company and show them metrics like this, I assume that doesn't hurt either.
So I'm a pretty popular guy with K Street lobbyists, because I can tell them exactly how much they're underinvesting in their Washington operation, or I can tell them how much they need to spend and what they need to spend on to get their merger approved, because this is really starting to get attention. Barron's just did a profile on our merger portion about 2 weeks ago, and it caught a lot of attention. But clearly, the companies need to understand Washington and just have that intelligence. I'll just leave you with this one point. Our firm was bought out at the beginning of this year, and the due diligence process was in the fourth quarter. And our company doesn't have a government affairs operation at all. And that company had significant exposure to tax reform. And the CFO called me up and said, "Oh my God, I would never have known about all these tax reform changes if you were not writing about it." And it turned out to be very incremental for our business overall. So they got a bit of a free rider, of the issue. But the fact that the CFO would have been handed over a 2,000-page bill on January 3rd and said, "Okay, now we got to figure out what this means for our business," we were able to map that out for the business just by having that. And I think just understanding what's happening in Washington is half the battle itself.
Indeed, and it is a battle, and I know your clients are grateful that they have you doing it.
Great.
Join me in thanking Dan Clifton for joining us today.
Great, thank you. Have a great conference.
And I'm president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. I know some of you are familiar. I think we had a couple of people say that you'd been here before for our case competition, and I'll tell you about this year's competition coming up. But at the foundation, our mission is to educate the public on how business does well, does good, and prepares for the future. And so we love it when a plan comes together like this event today. And we come to work every day thinking about the velocity of change that's going on around us, the complexities and the challenges. And there's one thing that we know that's true throughout any of the challenges that come up, and that's that business is part of the solution. And sure, it's about the speed of technology and disruption, but it's also about leadership and ethics and the role of business in society. And those are really important ideals to us. And that's why we do programs like this. And it's why 2 years ago we started our first MBA case competition. Now, it wasn't a big group of executives and strategists who thought of that program. The idea actually came from a young woman on my team, Sarah Castro. I know many of you have interacted with her. She had just earned her own MBA from McDonough. She's a Hoya. We have a lot of those in this building. But that first year, we thought, you know, if we could get 10 teams, if we could get 10 schools to sign up for that competition, that would be success. So it was really great. You know, 2 weeks into it, we had 34 teams from 19 schools register. We winnowed those down. The final 4 that year were Carnegie Mellon, Kellogg, GW, and Sarah, which one am I missing? Maryland. Sorry, I did know that list. So we knew we were on to something good. The next year, in year 2, which was just a few months ago, Sarah really turned on the gas. We had a really good thing going. And we had more than 150 teams from 50 schools across the country compete, up and down the East Coast, across the Midwest, the South, the West Coast as well. Again, we had to, well, that year we had to go and get a lot more judges. We didn't know we'd have 55 schools competing. But that year, the 4 finalists were Berkeley, Stanford, Maryland, and GW. And it was such a fun day, and it really drove home to us the importance of engaging and how fun we could do it with MBA students. And Sarah did another really smart thing throughout that process that she's captained. She talked to deans and faculty and the MBA students and who came to compete and asked them, what can we do as the foundation and the chamber to help you? What would you like to know more about markets and non-market forces and regulation? And that is what has shaped the program today. So it's in direct feedback from what we've learned, and we hope that you'll enjoy it. But I really want to give a big hand to Sarah, who's here today. This is her program. She's grown it, she conceived it, and it's just been great. So thank you, Sarah. Really, really terrific. Now, before I go, I just want to tell you a couple of things about the program today. We're not going to take breaks. You may have noticed that already. We have so much content, so many great speakers. We're just going end to end. If you need to get up, you know, feel free. There's coffee and snacks in the back. If you're not yet properly caffeinated, feel free. But before I go, I want to share with you one last thing, which is our foundation manifesto. A couple of you may have seen this before, but it's like, here we go. It's like our Pledge of Allegiance to American business. And it's where we say that we really believe that American business, and business around the world, is a problem solver and a difference maker. And if you look carefully at that last line, for what's new and what's next, we're in this together. And that's really our commitment to you. So wherever you go over the next year and wherever your studies take you, I hope that you'll consider the Chamber and the Foundation a resource and a partner. You know, as we look ahead to the challenges that we haven't even anticipated yet, who is going to lead us through those? Who is going to be able to bridge that intersection between policy and legislation and business and finance and all the things you'll hear today? Well, we're betting that that's you and the organizations that you are going to one day lead. We hope that you'll come back again and visit us in the fall. Our case competition opens in September, and you'll all hear about that. Registration opens in September. You would receive the case prompt in October. Then the final competition with the final 4 schools, again, just like the last 2 years, will be here at the Chamber. It's going to be a great event. We hope to get the numbers up even higher this year. And so thank you again for coming today, and you'll be hearing from us about that case competition. Thank you so much.
I'm on top of the world, eh? I'm on top of the world, eh? Been waiting on this for a while now, paying my dues to the dirt. I've been waiting to smile, eh? Been holding it in for a while, eh? Take you with me if I can. Been dreaming of this since a child. I'm on top of the world. I've tried to cut these corners.
Thank you to each of you. One of my favorite courses in college was a course on political advertising. And we looked at a lot of political ads from the early part of the last century. And by comparison, today's ads are tame. Maybe the biggest difference was that those ads were in newspapers that only a few people read, and so that, there was a chance to counter it. They didn't travel very fast. But a lot of what we're going to talk about today is not new, but it is changing. And what we have here are two practitioners who are at the cutting edge on key pieces of advocacy. My first big advocacy campaign was around the North American Free Trade Agreement. And at the time, you might recall that Ross Perot was arguing that all the jobs would be sucked into Mexico, the giant sucking sound to the... And, there was this whole series of attacks on NAFTA. And every time there was an attack, we would respond with talking points and explanations. And it kind of peaked. One of them was that, we would allow Mexican truckers on our road, and they would all be knocking grandma into the ditch. But eventually, two members of Congress actually took to the floor of the House and argued that NAFTA was giving Mexico water rights to the United States, and that this was Mexico's secret strategy to steal the Great Lakes. Of course, we responded with talking points. That didn't gain traction 25 years ago, and I'm pleased to report that every time I fly over the Great Lakes, they're still there. They've not moved to Mexico. But what might be different today is, I suspect today somebody would have picked up those statements on the floor of the House, and whether they were repeated on Breitbart or alt-right or by Elizabeth Warren, by the time we could blink, a third of this country would have believed it was true. And so the speed at which you have to adapt and change has really something we want to cover in this conversation. Now we're going to put up a slide. I think we're going to put up a slide that shows what I call all the tools in the toolbox. It is by no means sequential, nor does it mean that every tool needs to be used for every project. But what it does tell you is that one of the common misperceptions that I find when I go visit CEOs or general counsels who maybe aren't already engaged in Washington, who don't have Washington offices, is the perception that all that is happening in this town is lobbying, and lobbying is a big part of it. You saw the numbers, you saw but the reality is, I could never figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up in this town. I was kind of interested in the lobbying part. I was interested in communications. I saw political campaigns, but I didn't want to really run a campaign. I certainly didn't want to be so narrowly tied to one issue that I was a specialist in one issue and became a wonk on that one thing, right? So I felt for certain that by now I'd be unemployed, right? I'd be discovered as a fraud. I never chose which lane to drive down, right? But it turns out if you can put all these tools in a toolbox together, there is some value, right? And I get to run 3 major campaigns here at the Chamber. And anytime we take on a new issue, this is the list I put in front of me to begin to think, what are the right tools in the toolbox? What research and data do we need to bring to this discussion? I think especially for business, if you don't begin with good data and good research, it's all too easy to say that business is just whining about regulation. So you have to make sure you frame the argument and you have the right messages and you ground what you're advocating for in good data. We use a lot of events. There's 3,800 events in this building alone at the Chamber. Most of what we do is not paid media. It's really driving earned media. In fact, much of the paid media we do is really designed to drive some earned media. Coalition building is at the core of what we do. In fact, if you boil down everything that happens in this building, I would narrow it down to 2 issues: coalition building and storytelling. You can almost list everything else on there as an element of storytelling. Grassroots, and for those of you who don't know what grassroots are, that means volume. That means that when a member of Congress says, I've heard from 5,000 people on one side of the issue, sometimes it's the right answer to make sure that they're hearing from the other side of the issue. Grass tops is much more targeted. I remember one member of Congress told me, look, David, if this issue was important back home, I would have heard about it this weekend from one of my friends. And so sometimes you have to find out who those friends are and who the member of Congress is going to be around, and make sure that if it's important to them, that they're talking to the member about it. Regulatory engagement and all aspects of engaging with the regulators, and then, yes, lobbying, legislative strategy, and finally, litigation. It's the tool we like to use least because it's expensive, and courts aren't necessarily better legislators or regulators. But when all else fails, and when business can't figure out how to comply with a new rule or law, using the courts to address our grievances is an important part of it. So those are at the 50,000-foot level. Some of the tools in the toolbox. I'm sure there are others we could add to the list. And we've invited two leading practitioners in this space. In fact, I think you could argue that both of them kind of reinvented their piece of the space. Corey Elons is with Vox Global. He's the partner. Corey was not only a campaign manager, a successful campaign manager for a member of Congress, then was a communicator both on Capitol Hill, was a communicator on behalf of President Obama. Now appears, I told him he's got the whole base covered. He appears on Fox and National Public Radio. So I won't ask you on where you've seen him, but it's probably one or the other, because very few people do both these days. But most impressive, he was part of the Old Guard, which is the ceremonial guard that does helps recognize our fallen heroes, so maybe we can talk a little bit about that as well. Sure. Michael Ramlett runs a business called, and started a business called Morning Consult. Morning Consult reinvented the category of polling, right? In an era where it is really hard to differentiate noise from reality, understand where people really are. I remember the head of marketing at Procter & Gamble told me that if they change the lid on the toothpaste, they get 3 to 5 million emails complaining about the, right? But they've learned that those people are probably not hung up about the lid on the toothpaste 3 days later, right? So understanding what's real, what's noise, and finding a way to accurately measure it in a world where technology has changed, is really what caused the reinvention of that category. So if you've not heard of Morning Consult, I think you'll be a convert after today. So let me start by asking you both, tell us a little bit about your piece of the business, how you view successful campaigns, and what you're doing on behalf of your clients to achieve that.
Oh, I can start?
Yeah.
All right, good too. Good morning, everybody. Oh, you still need that second cup of coffee, but I'm with you. My cup is in the back, though, so I would advise you to get another one. Good morning again. My name is Corey Elons. I'm a partner with Vox Global, which is a public affairs and public relations communications firm based here in DC. You heard the bio already. Let me give you a sense of what those two pieces of our business refer to. The public relations and communications piece, you're probably really familiar with. This is the part that allows us to work with companies and organizations to promote issues and ideas that they care about to the broad general public and to narrowcast audiences that they want to focus on. The public affairs part is the part that we're focused on today. And that's the role where I'm not a lobbyist, not that there's anything wrong with being a lobbyist, but I'm not a lobbyist, I'm not a registered lobbyist, but we work very closely with lobbyists, corporate communications experts within organizations, and legal organizations within those institutions to shape and craft messages that will meet and deliver the message that they care about most to usually legislators and regulators in this town and in state capitals and municipalities around the country. That part of our business is about advocating on behalf of organizations to make sure that something gets done or doesn't get done. But in either case, some form of action is being taken that would be favorable to that organization. All the pieces that have been talked about here so far, as far as the tools in the toolkit, take a step back for a minute. Don't think about them in their individual pieces. Think about them as a communications collective. And what we're charged with doing when we work with clients is helping them to identify what are the best platforms that they can use to deliver the message to the audiences they care about the most. It may be one, it may be five, it may be all of them, depending on their budget and their issue. But ultimately, it's about delivering that message and getting them to take action. And if they take the action that you want, generally you're moving in the right direction.
And that tees up really nicely for what we do at Morning Consult. So if you kind of think about, when I look at advocacy, I almost think of it like it's a trial attorney, where you've got a lobbyist that's going to go out there and give your opening argument. You're going to have evidence development. You're going to talk about how you position that evidence publicly, and then you're going to have a closing argument. And so when we look at what Morning Consult does is we sort of sit in this place where we work in providing information that might lead to what goes into the opening argument. It's going to support what's going to happen kind of in between the opening argument and the closing argument. And it's going to be very specific to what you're really going to close on. And so for us at Morning Consult, it's essentially 3 business units. We collect data, and it's important to think about data as being unique to every communications or lobbying campaign. Sometimes it's economic data. That was kind of the historical piece of a lot of what was going into DC advocacy. It'd be what's the jobs impact, what's the impact to tax revenue, what's going to be the impact to the congressional budget. All those things are really important, but sometimes it's a little bit static. You're only in maybe those numbers once a year. And in the polling space, a lot of folks see it in terms of like who's going to win one congressional race or another. It's actually pretty interesting if you look at it beyond just the political context, but what do my constituents think or feel? Especially because it's going to be unique to each district and each part of the country. And so oftentimes folks will come to us to go collect that data in a survey environment. They'll then ask us to organize the data. So how do you put it in a software environment so you can open it up? You can look at the 15th district of Illinois, and if you're going to meet with John Shimkus, you're going to be able to walk in with data that's unique to the constituents in the 15th district of Illinois. It's a little bit more compelling when you talk to a member of Congress with data that's from that member of Congress's district than just saying nationally, here's what's going on. And then the third thing we focus on is actually how do you share that data. So I've got 18 full-time reporters, all with kind of New York Times, Politico, Bloomberg backgrounds, and they're trying to cover that intersection of Wall Street and business strategy, policy, and politics. And so when we look at kind of the world, we look at it as we're slotting into organizations like the units that David runs, or working with an organization like Corey's, where we're really there to integrate into what they're hoping to do from an overall strategy. And to give you the best kind of illustrative example of this is actually a unit here at the Chambers, CTEC Intelligence. So if you went to ctechintelligence.com, what you'd find is we're continuously pulling on a lot of new issues. So think like privacy and the issues that you've seen over the last few weeks, but extend it beyond just like the advertising space and looking at it in areas like drones, or looking at it in terms of like agricultural technology and all these new fields where there's not a lot of economic data because maybe the Bureau of Labor Statistics hasn't necessarily dug into it yet. But also Americans are just beginning to learn about these issues. And so one of the fun things we have is that you're essentially creating data for the first time that's going to be a benchmark for how public opinion and how the general kind of consensus on what is or isn't acceptable from a policy standpoint, how is that going to evolve? And so where we look at kind of the opportunity in the new age advocacy space is that you have a chance to really lay out a new status quo. And so for us, like, and you'll talk about it later today, because I noticed that Tim's on the docket for Techlash and some of his tech issues. It's a lot of fun because we essentially get the chance to take new technology, things that we would do with some of the biggest companies across our offices in New York or San Francisco, but actually apply them in a much more micro application here in DC and very specific to each congressional district.
So, Corey, when people hire you, what audiences are they typically trying to reach? How do you map out what audiences need to be reached to help develop a real strategy for your clients?
Well, it starts with the issue. It starts with the organization and the issue, and the environment in which they're trying to influence outcomes, right? So a lot of people would assume that when we talk about advocacy, that a lot of the focus is here in Washington, and that is true to a great degree. But as I mentioned before, you also have to think about our state legislatures, where there's a tremendous amount of activity happening right now. And you have to think about our municipalities also, whether that's county and city government as well. So a big part of what we're doing when we're thinking about this, let's start with Capitol Hill, let's just say. If we have, for example, if we're working for a financial services client, we want to make sure that we are focused on advocating to or talking with members of a specific committee that's associated with banking in the House and the Senate. The thing that's interesting about the audience is not just so much who they are, but how we can get to them. And that's, again, taking us back to the tools in the toolbox. So again, if you're building an integrated surround sound strategy in order to reach that particular audience, what are the tools that are available to you? One of the things that's most interesting to me that I've been most excited about in my work is the ability to reach audiences digitally. And there's been some conversation about that a little bit earlier this week as far as the ability to track and know what messages and content people are consuming and other things about them potentially. But when we're using that from an audience standpoint, and we know we want to talk to people on Capitol Hill and make sure they see our messages, we can now, through the use of digital technology, establish a geofence, a geo-targeting fence around Capitol Hill. We can set up a digital campaign, a digital ad campaign and social media campaign that allows us to target ads in that specific area so that when a member of Congress or someone on their staff opens up their phone or goes onto their social media platform, Facebook, Twitter, what have you, they will see, not Twitter, but Facebook and Instagram and the others, you see the ad about the issue that we want to move them on. That is extremely effective in making sure that your messages get in front of audiences. The other thing about digital communications is that not only is it effective, but it is trackable, meaning you know exactly who's seeing it, you know the times of day, you know which ads are most effective. Ads that aren't that great don't get a lot of engagement. Ads that are very good and working well get tons of engagement. Because of that, that allows you to switch up and change content on a dime. If you see an ad's not working, pull it down, put something back up. But generally, the audiences, going back to the top of your question, are legislators, regulators, and people who have the power to impact your license to conduct your business the way that you want on behalf of your community, your employees, and the business itself.
And that technology to push it out in that way is also the ability to pull it. So from our perspective, we're looking at it in different audiences and what we can gather about information to help shape or shift that strategy. So if you look from a chamber example with the foundation last year, many of you were part of the case competition, I'm sure. We had a chance to go out and do a survey of just MBA students about what do they think about the future of sort of business leadership, what do you think the priority set should be within that space. And then in addition to talking to just those individual MBA students, we're able to talk to 2,000 sort of general public, what do they think about those expectations. So now you get a good example of sort of where you have an elite audience or an audience that might be a little bit harder to reach. We're able to reach them through something like a LinkedIn or through more direct communication, but then you're able to analyze those results versus the general public. And so the same thing is going to happen in a lot of the business issues that you might face in a regulatory environment. Sort of what is it that CFOs think, or what is it that heads of HR think, or CIOs or CTOs, versus what does the general public think is the appropriate solution here? Because the sophistication in most of these policy debates is getting to a point in which here's the general public, and maybe they like to use the technology, maybe they interact with it on a daily basis, but they don't fully understand the business model behind it. At the same time, you have an elite audience that is looking at this from a much longer experience set, and they're going to have to think through what are the implications of any regulation action you're going to get out of an executive agency, or if Congress is changing legislation. So for us, it's kind of interesting, is essentially, for Corey's point before about the ability to push information, that same targeting and kind of data-rich environment also allows us to pull more information out of it.
So I remember we were surprised after several years of running a campaign around counterfeiting and talking about the evils of counterfeit products and what it means to consumers. We did a survey that helped us discover that when we use the word counterfeiting, 75% of the people thought we were talking about money, right? And so all this time, we clearly weren't connecting with our audience. How do people make sure that, what you say is actually what they hear?
That's a great question, because ultimately the definition of communications is making sure that your message gets through. If you're not heard, you're not communicating. If your message isn't resonating with the audience that you want to connect with, if your message isn't relevant to the audience you hope to communicate with, then you're not communicating. It's just noise. It's just noise in the background. So a big part of that comes back to the point you made earlier about research, and that's a big part of what Michael does. Research is the crux of everything that we do, and even more and more now than ever before, because we have access to so much data. There's no excuse for going into an environment and having that type of mistake made, because you have so much information available to you. So when you're beginning this integrated communications model, when you're building this campaign, the first thing you want to do after you establish what the issue is, what the real issue is, because sometimes you have the C-suite, legal, CorpCom, and GR all thinking the issue is something slightly different than what it is. So you have to come to consensus on what the actual issue is that you're advocating on. Get that consensus developed and finalized. Once you do that, then you can develop or consider the research that needs to be conducted in order to develop the campaign that will formalize the messages that you want to communicate. That's the next level. It not only tells you what messages the words and the messages to develop, it tells you which messages will be most effective with which audiences. Because there's always one message, but you want to emphasize different pieces of that message to different audiences so that they all take the same action that you want them to take. So research ultimately is, as I said, it's the foundation of what we do. And if we didn't have research, Michael wouldn't be in business. So I'm sure he's glad. That
Yeah,
we do
I
that,
mean,
right?
the thing too that's changing in the space is the real-time nature of it. It used to take a long time to collect this information. This year, I was saying before, we'll do about 6 million interviews. It'll traverse not only the US, but 24 countries. And it just used to be really difficult to get that type of real-time data. So if you look at it, like think about like the difference between like a United Airlines situation where you have a viral video on YouTube versus a situation maybe like your CEO, like Under Armour's CEO went on CNBC and said Trump was an asset. Steph Curry told the San Jose Mercury News he agrees if you remove the ET. Twitter explodes, but what does it mean for Under Armour as a brand? Both in terms of what they're operating with inside of DC, but more broadly because there's a large swath of the country that voted for the president, might be offended, but they also buy Under Armour gear. Or on the flip side, there might be strong supporters who don't like the president. For a brand, now all of a sudden, politics is a much more day-to-day type environment that you're operating in. And the research technology is changing. From our standpoint, what's really beneficial is you can actually go in and out of the field every single day. And I think ultimately the language you use to David's kind of question is really relevant not only to elites or to different portions of the country, but some of the vernacular is going to change across each of those constituencies. So to Corey's point, you got to have a real sense of what you're trying to do because the research, I can show you a lot of different cuts of data and they can lead to a large degree of analysis paralysis, but essentially what is the signal from the noise and being able to have a really consistent strategy makes it a lot easier for us on a research side to actually be able to design questions and give you data real time that makes you think about it differently or track it.
One other quick example of that, again, I mentioned we work for a number of financial services clients and we've been doing this work for, well, since and before the financial crisis 10 years ago, which is stunning to think that it's been that long ago. During that episode, these organizations were internally in crisis, and there were a number of threats that they were dealing with. One was legislative, to be sure, because there was a lot of legislative pressure coming from Capitol Hill in particular. Regulatory, because there was conversation about new organizations being established. And then there was the brand itself, the reputation of the individual brands of these big banks that were under the gun because of the challenges that we were facing economically. And so when you look at what is the imperative for those organizations when they're thinking about research, there's all the noise about what the headline of the day is in the paper, or on the web, but what's the actual impact? Is that really penetrating? So going back to Michael's point, it's important for them as an organization and as an industry to understand, okay, this is what's being said, but this is the ultimate impact that it's having, more or less than what we sincerely appreciate. We have our gut reaction to it, and oftentimes our clients and C-suite in particular, they have a gut reaction, I'm seeing this, we should do that. And it's the job of CorpCom and the job of legal and GR and others to say, wait a minute, let's take a step back, let's put Michael and his team in the field, and let's see what's really going on and how people appreciate that. Once you get a real sentiment of it, you can make a decision based on fact rather than based on your gut. And that's ultimately the type of decision you should be making, a fact-based decision.
And it's dangerous too, because if you think about it, in any of the roles you guys take on, all of a sudden, whatever you're working on a day in, day out basis is going to feel really important, or hopefully feels very important. And you feel like it's all encompassing and it's all you can think about. But you sometimes lose track of the fact that the rest of America is not thinking about that, or the rest of Congress isn't thinking about that. And I think this is oftentimes, I imagine, for Corey too, is how do you go into an executive C-suite across all these different functional roles? You have a business unit leader that thinks like this is a make or break moment for this business unit. And in some situations, it's basically explaining to him like, yes, I know it's really, really important to you, but no one has any idea what you're talking about.
That's right.
Or they don't care. That's right. And it's like, how do you, like, half of like client-facing skills in our business is to like, how do you deliver that message with like some degree of like comedy, grace, and pretty much ego stroking to essentially explain, at some level that yes, these are incredibly important issues, but just keep in mind that not everyone read the Wall Street Journal that day.
That's right.
Not everyone read that op-ed. I feel like 9 times out of 10 when we work on crisis type situations, it's not actually a crisis. We'll go in and out of the field same day, and we'll give data back to the communications function. And what the communications function I think likes about us is we're able to help validate their professional experience and their expertise around, is this a crisis, is it not a crisis? Whereas like the CEO might actually have the thinnest skin in the entire organization. They might be getting hit up
One bad email.
Yeah, one bad email.
One bad email from a customer.
My friend saw that on a Tuesday.
I was at the golf course this
Yeah.
weekend, and my guy
On Twitter, I got 3 alerts
man.
that this is a really bad thing.
That's right.
And being able to give them data, and it's more about us being able to give the data to the communications function or the lobbying function, because for a lot of organizations too, like your head of government relations for the organization is the one who's really taking a pulse of, is this a political issue, is it not a political issue? And there's a huge asymmetric information gap between your familiarity with politics and how the Hill works, how the White House works, executive agencies, and what the business unit leader necessarily understands. And in large part because they're focused on maybe other pieces around, how are we going to use commercial paper to finance this expansion in that country? It's a totally different skill set. And so in this kind of bridging the divide between DC and businesses, a lot of it, whether you're in communications or government affairs, is how do you take what you know in this particular market, explain it in the context of what it might be to the business unit, but also have kind of the courage and deftness to explain too where you got to honor your own skill set in the city, where you have no idea how American politics works sometimes, and you just got to trust your GR function or your communications function to explain it to you.
That's right, and it's as an external advisor to be sure, but it's also if you're in an organization, and especially, quite frankly, being in an organization, sometimes it's very helpful to have a third party like a Michael or me to come in and be the bad guy, so you don't have to take the heat because the boss doesn't believe you, but they might believe somebody who's not in the organization.
I know I've got about 20 follow-up questions. I'm sure there's lots in the audience, but we're out of time, I think. And so, in the spirit of always leave them wanting more, I hope you'll feel free to reach out with follow-up questions. How you communicate in a world where politics is so has divided people so much more clearly, it appears, into camps, and there's so much more we could be discussing. But I think you see why these guys are at the cutting edge of the field, and hopefully from this session you've also understood why these tools are an important part of success or failure as part of a broader set of tools in the toolbox. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now I'm on the outside. So you give me no reason for me to stay close to you. Tell me what love is still. How are we still breathing? It's never for us to choose or be the strength in you. Now I'm holding on.
All right. Good morning. We were talking before the panel started on what we thought our theme song might be. I was hoping for a little ABBA, but hopefully that got everybody awakened. Our panel today is very exciting in that we are going to talk about lobbying. Earlier this morning, you heard from Neil, you heard from David, you heard a lot about the ecosystem of how do you influence lobby makers, and I think that you learned that there are a lot of different tools in that toolkit to really influence the policymakers. But one of the tools is to hire lobbyists, and according to the Center for Responsive Politics, $3.36 billion was spent on 11,502 lobbyists in 2017. And so we will talk to you a little bit today about what that money is spent for and what a good lobbyist does. And so I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Susan Hirschman. I'm the CEO of Williams & Jensen, which is one of the top law lobby firms in town. My clients are pretty much in every sector. They range from Pfizer to Visa to GE to state treasurers. So I'm very fortunate that I have a pretty diverse portfolio of clients. And I will say that when you work with clients for a long time, you are, lucky enough that you go through some battles together. And my favorite thing that a client ever said about my firm is that no one is better at snatching victory out of the jaws of defeat than we are. And that was like that's always kind of been one of my favorite things people say about us. My background before I came to the firm in 2002 was I was the chief of staff for the majority whip in Congress. And now that House of Cards was popular for a while, everyone has a distorted view of what a majority whip does. Unfortunately, we cannot kill people if they don't vote the way we want or do what we want. So it's a little more complicated than that. I wish so it would have been a little easier if you had that tool, I suppose. Before that, I ran a conservative women's organization that had leaders in every state, and they did a lot of grassroots advocacy on policies. And then before that, I came to Washington to run the College Republican National Committee. And so I think that, having the background in politics, in policy advocacy, and then running the whip's operation of knowing how do you get legislation done and how do you stop legislation was very, very helpful to my clients. And so now we'll have our panel self-introduce and we'll jump right into it. So Patrice?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Patrice Willoughby, and it's really a pleasure to be with you today. I work at Invariant. I'm a lobbyist, lawyer by training, and also a musician by training before law school. Invariant is the largest woman-owned lobbying firm in the country. We are about 20 people, men and women. And I'm the Democratic lead in our technology practice. I represent large and small tech companies and also fintech, although the firm itself is a multi-client firm. So we have companies that are in a range of areas. My background was about 12 years on Capitol Hill, and then I served in the Obama administration as well. And on the Hill, I was chief of staff and counsel to Congresswoman Stephanie Tubbs Jones. So we look forward to speaking with you, and I'm sure that we would love to take questions at the end.
Hey, Kirk Blaylock from Fierce Government Relations. Thanks for having us. I'm the managing partner of the firm. We're the largest all-Republican lobbying firm, so we only focus on the Republican side of the aisle. We run the gamut of clients as well, from Apple to United Health Group to Union Pacific to Delta and Coca-Cola. In addition, we also work with trade associations, not unlike the U.S. Chamber, but the Business Roundtable, which is the largest organization, CEO organization of leaders in the country. So we sort of all do the same thing. And my background is I never set out to be a lobbyist. That wasn't my plan. As many of you have found yourself getting an MBA, that wasn't necessarily your plan maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but you sort of walked into it. I graduated from Auburn University. I came up here on an internship at the White House. I ended up being the personal aide for a guy named Lamar Alexander, who was a governor from Tennessee and then Secretary of Education and now U.S. Senator. I was also personal aide to a guy named Haley Barbour, who was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, and I spent 4 years with him traveling around the country. After I left Haley, I went to New York and worked for Philip Morris Companies, Inc., when Philip Morris was a top 10 Fortune company and owned Kraft, Miller Beer, and the tobacco end, and stayed there for 4 years. When President Bush 43 was elected, I was asked to go be the president's business liaison, so his liaison to CEOs, companies, trade associations, et cetera. So I did that the first 2 years of President Bush's first term, and then I left and have been at the lobbying firm I'm at for about 16 years. So really happy to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks. You know, I think what we all find is companies and trade associations hire lobbyists for different reasons. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And as we try to explain to you guys a little bit about what does a company get, what does a business get from their lobbying representation. What I find is we have clients that hire us in a lot of different ways. I mean, the easiest client, the kind of client to represent is the sophisticated business who is forward-looking. They anticipate the issues that they're going to face. We can do things in a very, start the engagement in a traditional way where we figure out what the issues are that they're gonna either have to try to push a proactive win on or play defense on. We figure out who are the champions who are going to help them. We educate the policymakers in the administration and in Congress at the leadership level, at the committee chairman the committee level, and we have the time to run a very sophisticated advocacy campaign. Those are fabulous clients, and I'm happy to say that I have a lot of them, and those are the clients of mine that did the best in tax reform. We had time to work the issues for a very long time, and the clients that understood that even though everybody else was saying that we were not going to have a tax reform bill, they wanted to be prepared for it anyway. I think we have a lot of clients that we're also happy to have, because quite honestly, a lot of times they pay us a lot more. Those are the clients that come to us when their hair's on fire. They just realize that government affairs and the advocacy world up here does impact their lives, and policymakers are going to have just done something or are about to do something that will adversely impact them. And those are issues that it's easy to get people's attention on the Hill because they've already engaged. But that's another type of client. And then I, also see a client that comes in and asks you to do something impossible. I remember I had a client that a potential client that came in and asked me to get a sole source contract for him. And then he started talking about all the money that he wanted to spread around and invited me to go to his house in the south of France. And I looked at him and said, if you want to work with me, you need to keep your wallet in your pants. And I'll tell you what's possible and what's not possible. And that gentleman ended up being someone that I chose not to work with. And so, and also, I'd like for us to talk a little bit about, what we do for clients offensively, defensively, and quite honestly, what a lobbyist is. I still think that my mother doesn't know what I do for a living. And so hopefully by giving you some examples of some of these engagements that we do, you'll understand a little bit more about what we do. So what is a lobbyist? Patrice?
So I think at its most basic, companies have lines of business that they would like to advance. And lobbyists are hired in order to protect and defend those business lines, to create an environment in which the business can grow and thrive. And so we always think of our representations, government relations, as growing revenue. And many times that takes the format of working on a regulation, working to expand or contract a regulation. Sometimes we work to introduce legislation, and increasingly we are working in the area of creating awareness of our clients' products and services before they run into problems. Because I think the last thing that you want to do as a lobbyist when your client has a problem is to have to run up to Capitol Hill or to an agency and try to resolve it. So we see our business evolving in a lot of the area of public affairs and awareness. Because there's always this dichotomy between what policymakers want to do and the business of business. And we spend a lot of time translating that to both advance and prevent legislative activity.
Yeah, I think that's right. We're basically, and I think that on Neil's panel, he talked about tools in the toolkit. As you go through your MBA program, you divide that up into classes. Why are you taking marketing? Why are you taking economics? Why are you taking finance? Because most companies and most businesses will have, if you're a consumer products goods company, you're going to have a very vast marketing department, and that's part of your toolkit to market your products. Lobbyists are no different than that. I would assume that probably in your MBA program you haven't had a class on lobbyists as you've had, or on government affairs, maybe some of you, like you've had on finance or economics or other subjects. But because government is so pervasive now at the federal, state, and local level, it affects every company every day in many ways, and that can be through tax law, that can be through labor law, that can be through benefits and HR, that could be through environmental law on siting and building facilities, that could be on minimum wage. There are so many aspects of government that affect companies that one of the tools in the toolkit is to have a government affairs operation that employs lobbyists, and whether that's in-house lobbyists, many larger companies have large offices here with in-house lobbyists, or trade associations that may have in-house lobbyists. You also have companies that don't have a government affairs operation here and employ lobbyists, contract lobbyists, who represent them almost as if they're their Washington office. And so we're a tool in the toolkit to help educate, explain issues to members and regulators and members of the administration on policies and how those policies will affect business. There's a lot of what you do in your MBA environment is you look at case studies, and you study case studies on business decisions that went correctly and on business decisions that went wrong, and retrospectively looking back on those, what were the decisions were made where this went wrong, and how could have it been improved? And you guys debate this out in your MBA classes. Well, what we do is really case studies, but they're live case studies. And how a decision can impact your business is truly important. Some companies, as Susan said, are well established and have been here for a very long time and understand it and have a routine and are invested in the operations of government affairs. Other companies, new entrants particularly, FANG and High Tech, which are more new entrants to the Washington game and state government affairs game, have had a lot of catch up to do. Bill Gates found himself many years ago, as you will recall, not wanting to have a Washington office, and then found him in an antitrust investigation and then had to develop a Washington office. Facebook was well ahead of their current problems because they had a well-established government affairs operation, and my former colleague, Joel Kaplan, who was Deputy Chief of Staff at the White House, runs their external affairs. Very good, robust plan and set of lobbyists who were able to manage Mark's testimony in an effective way this week. Amazon has been building a large government affairs practice here in town, and they obviously have a lot of issues. Each one of them could be their own case study of issues that they have before the government. So I think you need to look at lobbyists as tools in a toolkit and reflect upon how each individual lobbying opportunity could potentially be a case study in business school on effective government interaction, involvement, and education, and how that relates to an outcome that could have huge financial impacts to any given business.
And I would just add to that, I know from outside of the city, it probably looks like there are no rules in this town, and that it may even look like there's a lot of chaos. And particularly with the new administration, we had a lot of clients that we'd had for a long time that were trying to figure out, how do we operate in this new world? I would just say, and I think we would all agree, that our rules change a lot, but there are a set of rules. And if you want your issue to be heard, I think good representation can help you figure out how to get your message heard and get the facts to the right people, and really understand the pressure points, the danger zones. I mean, we all know that, you know, as much as we'd like to think back to, and you guys are all probably you're all too young to remember the "I'm Just a Bill on Capitol Hill." We should have had that as our theme song actually. But there, you know, most every piece of legislation that gets across the finish line does not move independently. It is most always attached to a bigger vehicle. And understanding what those opportunities and those threats are really can help you figure out how to be effective. And you know, one of the issues that I think we're all coming to terms with and that we all face is that how lobbying has changed. I mean, the one thing that in this town that I think is almost a given, if you read an article and it has a point of view, that is not organic. The first thing I think when I pick up a policy paper, when I pick up a newspaper or read a blog piece, and it has a particular point of view that impacts my client, I either think, good job, we got it in, or who's pushing that? And I think that that is, you know, a good opportunity to talk a little bit about how social media is changing our environment and how lobbying has changed. Do you?
Sure. So one of my clients is Uber. And Uber has been in the news a lot last year, and following a release of a memo that implicated a hostile work environment. And so they have been very engaged in the business of their business, but had not really engaged fulsomely on Capitol Hill. And so when they began to encounter a lot of problems last year, we spent a lot of time discussing the company, and also as they came up with their mitigation strategies and made changes within the company, we have spent the following months really communicating that to Capitol Hill. I think that with the advent of social media, companies have to be able to respond very quickly. It has both, social media has both positive and negative ramifications. One being that if there is a negative hashtag or something that's trending, companies have to be prepared to respond to both policymakers, but also to respond and to frame a narrative and push back on social media themselves. But on the positive side, I think that social media is evolving an ecosystem in which companies are more responsive, more transparent, and people are more informed on the operation of business, and I think that that makes for a better business climate overall.
Yeah, I'll use an example of social media that you'll identify with. So the airlines for some time here in town have been complaining to regulators and to members of Congress on the advent of the emotional support animal on airplanes. It's disruptive. It causes passengers to be upset because people bring in larger pets than they should be to sit in their lap. And because these owners had gone to a website and paid $29.99, they could easily bring on an emotional support animal to travel with them. Now, these emotional support animals came in different forms. Some of them were pigs, some of them were goats, some were parakeets. You know, yeah, there are some dogs and cats in there too, but people were kind of going a little crazy with these emotional support animals. So we were spending time explaining this to policymakers, and not just one airline, but multiple airlines. And the advent of social media has sort of helped with that a little bit. As you know, social media could be both a positive and a negative for airlines. It was certainly a negative for airlines who have removed passengers from airplanes unwillingly, where other passengers take video of that and then post it on their Twitter feed or right on the airline's feed. But part and parcel of that, we used the same social media technology to make sure that people knew that a woman tried to bring a peacock on a plane. And that example of a woman trying to bring on an emotional support animal for a peacock allowed Delta and United and others to put forth new pet policies that completely eliminated those animals from traveling, tried to establish a much more rigorous set of standards. This is self-policing by the airlines, but what they did by explaining it ahead of time and then using social media to make the point was that they softened the ground for their ability to get away with putting tighter regulations to where Congress would say that would make sense. We don't need to do anything. They're self-regulating and they're solving their problem, and what they're doing is appropriate. And so there are things that don't even require legislation or regulation, but that require lobbyists and a government affairs operation to soften the ground with regulators and policymakers to make sure that action that a company is taking is sensible, is fair, and makes sense.
You know, in today's world, I think what we're also finding is that a lot of policymakers don't have, and I think particularly in Congress, I think we see more and more of a polarization where, you know, you don't have as many members in the House, really, or the Senate, more the House. It's more of a problem in the House. In the center, you know, you've got more Republicans that are very far on the right, more Democrats that are very far on the left. And as that polarization occurs, a lot of these members care more about their primaries than they do their general elections. And so they care more about the thoughts of fewer constituents, quite honestly, that who can make a difference in a primary. And so while I will say that your average member of Congress is less sophisticated, certainly, than any of you in the room when it comes to social media, I do think that their reliance on it is evolving. Yep. They're trying to understand it. They're trying to figure it out. And I know I had one client that, and I'll say who it is because Senator Grassley, who has been around, who is, you know, a senator that's very senior and it's been there very long. And we were doing some social media for Senator Grassley. And at first my client said, oh, Senator Grassley, why would you do social media with him? There's no way he understands social media. And it's actually not true. He's actually one of our more sophisticated members with social media. He does his own tweets. And if you have the right social media tagged the right way, he certainly is one of the more sophisticated members at reading it. But I think, you know, I think both of your examples are great because it's not just the going in and talking to the member of Congress that will really get them enough of an education, because I think there is an increased skepticism of all things Washington, D.C. And today's successful campaign involves social media. It involves advocates in their district. They don't just want to hear from their leadership or lobbyists or their committee chairman. I think they really want a sense that what we're advocating, what companies are advocating, is something that's really important to their constituents. Do you have any examples of that or anything to add on that?
No, I think that's right. I mean, just as lobbyists are a toolbox and are part of your toolbox, social media is a part of our toolbox, just as a part of companies' toolbox to communicate with their customers. And we use it all the time. We will suggest it as a part of any campaign. You know, I think that many of you are very familiar with geofencing, where you can just geofence a certain area with a certain message. You know, lobbyists in common practice will suggest what to geofence and where. It is quite common that when Republican leadership has a retreat out on the Eastern Shore, that there will be 10 different companies or coalitions or campaigns that will geofence a mile around the resort to make sure that those messages are getting through and are popping up on their Twitter feed. That didn't happen 5 years ago, but that is a tool in our toolkit that we are trying to get those messages across to members wherever they are, whether it's back at home, whether it's when they're traveling somewhere, or whether it's when they're sitting up in their office on Capitol Hill.
Okay, listen, we'll go to Q&A because we want you all to have plenty of time to ask us questions. So, questions?
Hello. Hi, my name is Darsh. I'm an MBA student at Georgetown University. My question is sort of, what is an example of something that someone from, in the C-suite or a business leader might not understand about, government relations, about lobbying that, you might not be able to learn in a presentation, or you might not be able to learn on a panel? Like, what is an example of a real world situation where a business leader, learns something about, interacting with policymakers and institutions that, they didn't expect to learn?
Patrice, you want to take the first shot at
Sure. I would say the importance of engagement. We had a client that was a major manufacturer of industrial chemicals, and one of them was ammonium nitrate, which is a fertilizer that's been used in homemade explosives and also in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we came up against a regulation from the Department of Homeland Security, which would have effectively ended their ability to sell ammonium nitrate. And while some other industrial chemicals that are similarly explosive would have remained outside that regulation. We were able to get the regulation turned back, and it completely changed the company's viewpoint on government relations, because prior to hiring us, they didn't really want to engage. They wanted to sort of keep their head down and work it behind the scenes, but saw that when their business was threatened, it was important to engage in a number of areas, both Capitol Hill and also within the agency.
I'll give you one more example on that. That's not an issue example, but that's a personality example. It relates to Senator Ted Cruz, who, from my view, is a very good and smart and capable senator who represents Texas really well. But his public persona, the one that you might have just viewing him on TV or seeing what other people say about him, might be quite different from that. And I can take in business leader after business leader, CEOs, non-CEOs, and their perception of Senator Cruz before the meeting to after the meeting is 180, just completely different, because he is that. He is very thoughtful, very smart, very engaging, and is willing, particularly for Texas companies, to dive into an issue and work on it. And so I think that is another example of engagement by business leaders where they see something on TV or they hear it from their friends and they have a perception about it, and therefore they don't want to do it. But after having done it and met the policymaker, they understand why it's important and why this person can be so effective for them in their business.
And conversely, and just to build on what Kirk said, there are perceptions that policymakers have of the business community and that are unfounded. And one of our jobs as lobbyists is really to share and to educate on what those businesses are and the people behind them. And we find that policymakers, when they engage with business leaders, when they're actually able to talk about goals and outcomes and sort of cut through all of the rhetoric of politics, they often have a lot in common, and it really does influence the policymaker's decision on whether to take some type of action, because they know and firsthand have spoken with someone within the business community.
And Patrice, I think that is a really good example that sometimes people are afraid to engage policymakers because they think they may be on the opposite side or that they may have some biases, but you're always better off, almost always, better off to go in and try to engage and explain your side of the issue. Another question? Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Eric. I'm an MBA student with Johns Hopkins. I had a question about how a firm like yours would respond to an event in the news, whether it's a news scandal, a viral video, possibly a presidential tweet. When that affects one of your clients, what does the response to that look like?
So it depends on what it is, and I will tell you, that was a real live question. We got a lot in the beginning of this year. And so what you hope is that your client is engaging before the tweet. I'll give you an example. I had a client who had an operation in a state that was very important to the president, and that we knew that we were going to, quite honestly, the business was going to make some changes that had already been in the works. And when they told me when they were going to do it, it just so happened the date that they were going to do this, they had planned to do it, was the day before the president was going to be in that state. And so the first thing I said is, do you think we could make the announcement, could we shift the announcement to a different time? And so I think doing everything that you can to sort of mitigate it. I think the other thing too that we sometimes advise clients is how not to overreact to it, because a lot of times a business will overreact, and what could be a short-lived story will become a lot more in depth. And if it really is a scandal, I mean, which we advise the client to do, and you can't always be successful at it, but what we advise the client to do is not put their head in the sand, and to get all the facts out as quickly as they can get them out. And so it's a little bit dependent on the situation, but we've used all of those techniques. I mean, Kirk, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, it obviously depends on the situation and whether it involves an issue that involves a policymaker or not.
Right.
I can tell you that in the first 4 months of this administration, I probably, at least in the majority of my clients, had a full discussion about dealing with what if you get a presidential tweet, and how do you manage that, and what is the communications plan internally for the company that is operationalized now, so that if you get one, you have the right people on the phone to manage the situation, to respond effectively or to not respond. And so I think part of it is just being ready and planning. It's somewhat akin, some of you might have taken a crisis communications class related to your MBA program on how to deal with crisis communications, and you know that in that there's a planning process that goes into it and a function to be prepared for something that might happen. And so I think that preparing our clients strategically is an important part of what we do. We're not just knocking on doors and talking to members, we're also helping them build a strategy about how to manage any given situation that they might be presented with, and presidential tweets or policymaker tweets are certainly something that we
Kirk,
plan
didn't you
for.
see a little bit of an evolution in that too? I mean, a lot of my clients went from scared to death of a tweet to like, oh, okay, we
Right.
get this now. How do we use it to our advantage?
Yes.
Oh, we're gonna let them know that we're doing this with X jobs, and so went from being very afraid to another tool in the toolbox.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. There has been an evolution. I mean, I think that this administration is new for everybody, and it's certainly one that has made lobbyists in town have to adjust their techniques on approaching this administration. Having been in 2 Bush White Houses, both 41 and 43, we had a very distinct line of communication, a distinct line of policy-making process, and everyone knew sort of what their role was. This White House operates much differently. Ideas and decisions come from a lot of different places, and the president can overrule that at any time, even if his cabinet secretary has already been out there on something. And so learning how to understand where the policymaking process is and who is in fact speaking on behalf of the president where the policy is something that we've all had to get used to and adjust our mindset on. But I think that's also an effective role for lobbyists in terms of helping companies, clients, trade associations, coalitions figure out this new landscape. We'll go through the same thing after the upcoming midterm elections. It's possible that you could have change in control in one house or the other in terms of party control, and that will change the lobbying dynamics and the strategies that we will use with our clients on how to approach issues, depending on who is the chair of certain committees and who's in leadership, et cetera. And so having those relationships, understanding the dynamics between members, understanding who has votes for certain things, understanding who has seniority on things, that all sort of coalesces into the strategies that we'll help develop for our clients on how to proceed with their issues going forward. So the landscape of a new White House and midterm elections present a huge opportunity for us to be a part of that strategic making.
And it's all good for business, right, Patrice?
Well, it is very good for business, and it is a continuous and it's an ongoing and dynamic process because we begin every administration or every session of Congress by trying to get the lay of the land in terms of who the decision makers are, what opinions they hold, what the dynamics are, as well as alignments in Congress. However, as administrations progress, those dynamics also change. And so we have to, and this is the value of government relations, we are eyes and ears on the ground. We keep our nose to the ground to keep ahead of changes of opinion and priorities, as well as who the key decision makers are. And so as those tweets come or as new initiatives are announced, we're in the position of being able to inform whether or not it's something that is a real or a perceived threat, or even something that our clients need to react to.
And I would just say as maybe one more question and then, yeah, yes, ma'am. Oh, you don't have a microphone, do you? I think this is our last question. I think I'm getting that look.
Hi, I'm Ping Xia, the Hopkins MBA student. You all probably heard the Cleveland hospital incidents, and that, because I'm also in the field for over 20 years. Behind this incident is the policy making, and there's a big gap, and this field is really pretty much regulated by the professional society, American Reproductive Medicine. But I see a lot of clinics all got, oh, you probably don't know the incident.
No, we do.
No, we do.
Oh, you do?
We
Yeah.
were just confirming that we knew what we were talking about.
Yes. I'm sorry. I thought that's a big news. I feel so bad for these patients. So the American Society for Reproductive Medicine is pretty much making all the regulations, and some of them are really not taking effect. So how do we approach lobbies to make really, it's not based on each clinic, how they fire a person, how to make the lab rules. It's really about the policy at the higher level. At the Congress, you know, you need to have a policy to start with to prevent incidents happen like this.
I go back to an incident that we had with one client in which their business priorities were at odds with their trade association. And that is something that happens more often than you would think, and it's also sort of the value of government relations for individual companies. Policy at a higher level, whenever there's a governing entity, is often guided by the loudest voice or the deepest pocketbook. And so I think the value of government relations in what we do for individual companies is to educate policymakers on how an individual proposal from a trade association or a larger entity affects various actors in a space. But it is a dynamic process, and it is always an issue of trying to find those members of Congress and the administration that align, and so that you can prove your case.
So I would just thank you all for participating in this program and participating in today's panel, and hopefully you got just a little slice of what we all do. But I would strongly encourage you, as part of your education, if you have an opportunity to do a fellowship, an internship, either in government or with one of our firms. And I know for the right kind of people, we welcome people to come for a week or for 2 weeks, just to kind of learn what we do. And I think you all obviously highly value your education, and there's nothing like hands-on experience to supplement that education. So I'd greatly encourage you to do that if you have the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Stop me up.
Good morning. My name is Chris Padilla. I'm Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs at IBM. I am an in-house lobbyist in charge of representing IBM before governments, not just here in Washington, but worldwide. And I'm going to speak with you today about how a company deals with uncertainty in a political environment. In the previous discussion, you heard a lot about engagement, and you heard about companies wondering how do they deal with a presidential tweet? How do you prepare for that? What do you do? So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is take you through what the first year of the Trump administration has been like for a major American technology company. And I'm going to put you in my shoes with a number of key questions that we faced, unpredictable situations, unprecedented situations for which there was no playbook. And I'm going to ask you, what would you have done in my shoes? And then I'm going to tell you what we did and why. And I'll tell you right away, there's no right answer or wrong answer. In fact, most of the questions I'm going to ask you, and get your apps ready, I hope you all downloaded it this morning. Most of the questions I'm going to ask you, on all the possible responses, there's one that we chose, and then there's others that other companies chose. And so there's no right or wrong. But we're going to talk about why we did what we did, and I hope that'll give you some insight into what it's like to sit inside a company and deal with how do you engage beyond partisanship in an unpredictable situation. So I mentioned that I work for IBM, and we believe in engaging, but engaging guided by values. And I'm going to talk about what our values are, but it's important you understand a couple things about IBM. We are old. We were founded in 1911. We've been around for more than 100 years, and that influences how we make decisions on things. We have values as a company that we believe in strongly. IBM has a long history of, for example, being one of the first companies to hire senior female executives, to hire African Americans as sales representatives, to hire people with disabilities, to have a global company policy around non-discrimination based on sexual orientation or religious beliefs. Those are values, and they mean something in our company, and they've grown to be ingrained in our culture over 111 years. First scenario. It's November 8th, 2016, Election Day in the United States. We knew there was going to be a new president. We'd worked well with President Obama over the previous 8 years. There was going to be a new president. We needed a strategy. How are we going to engage with the new administration? Well, we were all set. We had the letter written. Dear Secretary Clinton, congratulations on your victory. Here are a few ways we can work together. And then this happened. Nobody expected it. We certainly didn't expect it. There's not a single pollster in America that expected it. We had run a small internal contest in IBM Government Regulatory Affairs worldwide to see who would predict the correct electoral vote outcome. And out of 120 people, one guy got it right, and he lives in Bulgaria. Tells you what we know. So what do we do? Well, we had some history to fall back on. I mentioned we're old. This is a telegram from Thomas Watson, the founding chairman of IBM, to Edith Wilson, the widow of President Woodrow Wilson, consoling her on his passing because we had met with and worked with President Woodrow Wilson. In fact, IBM has engaged with every president of the United States since Woodrow Wilson. Here's a picture. The guy here on the far left is Thomas Watson Sr., the guy who sent that telegram. He's in the Oval Office meeting with Franklin Roosevelt. He was one of the few American business executives, actually, who supported the New Deal. His son, who was the next chairman of IBM, Thomas Watson Jr., is in the picture, also in the Oval Office with President Jimmy Carter. In fact, Tom Watson Jr. later served as U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union under President Carter. So I mentioned we have a history of engaging. Here's an IBM chairman, John Akers, with President George H.W. Bush receiving an award for quality in the early 1990s. And here is our current CEO and chairman, the lady with the blonde hair. In September 2016, she met, as she had met many times, with President Obama. This is a meeting in the Oval Office with President Obama to talk about trade. And 6 months later, there she is again in the cabinet room, seated next to the new president, Donald J. Trump. Republicans, Democrats, across well more than a century, we engaged with them all. That's what companies do, because no matter who's in charge, business goes on. It's important to engage and to have relationships with an administration and with the Congress, regardless of their party or their policy. But imagine that it's November 9th, 2016, the day after the election. You're the CEO of IBM. The unexpected has happened. What do you do? Here are your 4 choices. Do you send an email to all employees, consoling them for their shock at the result? One company did this. Do you announce that while your company's preferred candidate did not win, you will work with the new president? Do you write to the new president-elect congratulating him and offering some ideas on how you could work together? Or do you do nothing? Companies should stay out of politics. So go ahead and cast your votes. I don't know how long I'm supposed to wait. Well, the results are pretty clear. So as I mentioned, there's no right or wrong answer. The first one is what Apple did. Tim Cook sent a note to all his employees, and he did it because there were reportedly employees in tears that day in Cupertino, and said, quoted Martin Luther King and said, "Don't worry, everything will be okay." There were some who recommended that that's what we do inside IBM. The second is what Google did. Eric Schmidt, the then chairman of Google, had actually endorsed Hillary Clinton overtly. He was at her victory party, or planned victory party, in Manhattan on the evening of November 8th, was photographed there wearing a badge saying staff. And he said, well, obviously the candidate that I endorsed didn't win, but we'll work with this guy anyway. A lot of companies did D. They said nothing. They went quiet. Oh my God. And they called the lobbyists, like the ones you just had on the previous panel, and said, what the hell do we do? What we did was to write a letter. We took the letter that we had drafted to Secretary Clinton, tossed it in the shredder, and wrote a new letter in about 12 hours. And we said, congratulations, Mr. President-elect, which some people didn't think we should say. And we tried to identify some areas in which we might work with this new administration, and we picked areas that we thought would be consensual. In other words, areas where there would be consensus, bipartisan consensus, to do practical things. We didn't, in our opening letter, say, we disagree with you on trade, which we do, but we didn't choose to say that in the first letter. We said, we can work with you on building intelligent and secure infrastructure. We can work with you on improving how we care for our veterans using technology. We can help to transform America. We can create what we call new-collar jobs by having new training and apprenticeship programs for people in the middle of America, not in Silicon Valley or in New York, where we're based, but in places like Michigan and Iowa and Missouri, where we're hiring people to do jobs in cybersecurity and web design, even if they don't have a 4-year degree. You don't need a PhD in math to work at IBM, but you do need to know something about technology. And we said, Mr. President, we think that's an area we can work with you, and a lot of those, by the way, may be your voters. That's what we did. Here's an example of what the result was. Fortune magazine, January 2017. Tech CEOs present a $1 trillion savings plan to the Trump administration. President-elect invited the CEOs of the technology industry to meet with him at Trump Tower. I went as a staff person. I was not in the actual meeting, but we were in a holding room, and I met a lot of interesting people. Sean Spicer, Anthony Scaramucci, Mike Flynn, except none of them are there anymore. But I did meet them. This administration, by the way, is great for folks who are in the government relations business because you're always going to need to meet new people. So what did we do? We took a plan and we gave it to the President-elect and said, Mr. President-elect, we think you can use technology to modernize the federal government and save $1 trillion. And Mike Pence, the Vice President-elect, said, I'd like a copy of that. Here's my cell phone number. Please come and talk to me. That was our first interaction with the new President-elect. By the way, interestingly, Trump Tower, the building right behind it on the other block, is IBM's main building in Manhattan. You can see Trump Tower from the offices at 590 Madison Avenue, which is IBM in New York City. So it wasn't a long walk, and we made that point to President Trump, or our CEO made that point to President Trump in the building and in the meeting, and his reaction was, is your building for sale? Always looking to expand the empire. It was a joke. It was a joke. Okay, so President Trump is inaugurated January 27th, 2017, Executive Order 13769. Anybody know what that was? Anybody? No? Travel ban. Let's not let in people from, I think it was at first 6, and then it was 9, and then it changed, Muslim majority countries. Set off chaos, turmoil. The airports, remember the chaos in the airports? This was hugely controversial. One of the first things the new administration did, January 27th, 7 days after the inauguration. Okay, it's January 28th. The controversial travel ban has been announced. You are a corporate leader of a technology company. What do? Sue the government to prevent the imposition of the ban. Organize protests in your company campus. Suggest ways other than a ban to protect national security, or nothing, because travel bans are not corporate business. Cast your votes. Okay. A little bit more divergence on this one. A is what quite a number of technology companies did. There were suits filed, successful suits, by the way. One of the reasons the travel ban never went into effect is that a number of states and localities and private groups, including companies, sued the government, arguing that the travel ban was unconstitutional, and they won. And a number of technology companies filed amicus, or friend of the court briefs, in those cases to stop the ban from going into effect. We were not among those companies. Some companies organized protests at their locations, including Google. A friend of mine was at Google on the day the travel ban was announced and said there was actually a spontaneous walkout, people protesting in the grounds outside the Google offices saying the company had to do something to stop this. A lot of companies did D. In fact, most non-technology companies did nothing at all. They said, this is not our business, we're not affected, we're not going to do anything. We were affected. We had a few employees who were affected by this, and we went and had a meeting. Our CEO had a meeting with who was then the Secretary of Homeland Security, now White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, and said, you know, General Kelly, if what you're trying to do is stop terrorists from getting into the United States, there are better ways to do it than a blanket travel ban. We have technology, software, that is in use today, used in fact by the TSA. Any of you in the TSA pre-check program? Yeah, pre-check, okay. You give some information to the government, they vet you, and then you get to stand in the shorter line, you don't have to take off your shoes. That's run by IBM software. There's no reason the same principle couldn't be used to vet people who want to come to the United States on a refugee visa or a non-immigrant visa. In fact, technology like that is used by the Defense Department to look at people who are of concern for terrorist activities in war zones. And so that was our approach, to say, you know, there's a better way. You can accomplish your objective using technology in a more targeted way. And in fact, that's generally the direction in which DHS is heading, recognizing that a blanket travel ban is not the best way to go. We have values. I mentioned we have values as a company. These are our values. I won't go through them in detail except to say the last one, leading the world of business in diversity, inclusion, and tolerance. We were the first company to hire an African American sales vice president, the first company to have a female vice president, one of the first companies in America to hire a blind person. And so we have always felt it's important to put those values into practice. And in the environment that we've had over the last year and a few months, we felt that's even more important. And we had an opportunity to do that last year. Engaging to Win, July 14th, 2017. Anybody here from Texas? Anybody live in Texas, from Texas? Anybody know what was going on in the Texas legislature last summer? There was a bill called a bathroom bill to decide which bathroom you would use. Depending on the bill was, you must use the bathroom of the gender that's on your birth certificate, regardless of how you identify. IBM engaged on that legislation because we have a very active LGBT community in IBM, and they said that's not right. We also have 10,000 employees in Texas and a number of research facilities. And we have always practiced that you can go to the bathroom and use the locker room of your gender identity. And you decide what your gender identity is, not the government. And we were against the Republican governor, the Republican lieutenant governor, the Republican-controlled Senate, but the Republican-controlled House in Texas was where we fought this battle. And we took out full-page ads in the Dallas Morning News. No one should face discrimination for being who they are. But we did more than that. We went down and had 130 meetings with members of the Texas legislature. We organized fly-ins. We wrote op-eds. We did a national media campaign, and we won. With the help of a few others in the tech industry, most of whom sat in Silicon Valley and sent tweets from their offices, while we were burning up shoe leather in Austin, Texas. And we did this because we are motivated by values. The title of my presentation, Engaging Driven by Values. And so what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you suck up to who's in power just because they're in power. It means you engage with them, you meet with them, you talk to them. That's what engagement is. It doesn't mean you agree with them. It means if you disagree, and in fact our letter, the letter we sent to President-elect Trump said this, there will be times when we agree and times when we disagree, but we will try to engage. That's been our basic approach. This was one where we happened to disagree with the parties that were in power in Austin, Texas, and we fought against them vigorously, and we were successful. August 16th, 2017. Anyone remember what happened last August 17th? Charlottesville, Virginia. The tragic death, the racist riots, the neo-Nazis. And the president said, there are some fine people among those folks. Do you remember the level of controversy? Do you remember the outcry? We, as part of our engagement with the administration, our CEO had joined something called the President's Strategy and Policy Forum, which was a group of about 15 CEOs and senior executives from across the business community. Trademark, marquee names, J.P. Morgan Chase, Boeing, Merck, others. We were on that council, and everyone said, how can you serve on this man's council when he won't denounce neo-Nazis? This was intensely controversial. So it's that day, shortly after the violence in Charlottesville, the president's response has generated controversy. Your CEO is on the President's Strategic and Policy Advisory Forum. What do you do? Nothing? It's tragic, but it's not a corporate matter. Do you work with the advisory council members and break up the group? Do you resign? Do you refuse to ever again deal with the administration? There were quite a few people who resigned from the council via Twitter. Elon Musk, Ken Frazier, the CEO of Merck, took a very early and quite principled stand. I don't know if he did it on Twitter or if he did it on CNBC, but there were a number of CEOs who said, we're out, we're done, that's enough. There were quite a few people who said, this president is irredeemable, unfit, you should refuse ever to deal with him again. And by the way, there were some people, quite a few people, IBM employees, who told us that's what we should do. What we did was B. Our CEO wrote a letter to all employees worldwide, all 400,000 IBMers worldwide, and said, we engage, we've always engaged. You'll see here, we've engaged with every president since Woodrow Wilson, and we will continue to engage, but this group can no longer serve the purpose for which it was formed. And she, along with Mary Barra, the CEO of GM, got on the phone with the other members of the council and said, we need to disband the group. And they did. They disbanded the group. Steve Schwartzman, the chairman, was charged with telling the White House. And as soon as he did that, about half an hour later, the president sent out a tweet and said, I'm disbanding the group. Thank you for your service. That's not exactly how it happened. That doesn't really matter all that much, but the point is the group was disbanded. So then what? What do you do next? What do you do next? Do you just refuse to engage with these people? March 21st, we were at the White House. This is an IBM employee, the young woman in the upper left, talking about new-collar jobs, apprenticeship programs. How do we get federal money to be more effective in training people for the jobs of today? December 18th, this is our CEO with Ivanka Trump, with some students at a high school we sponsor in Connecticut called PTech. That's a grade 9 to 14 high school where you graduate with a high school degree, an associate's degree in technology, and a guaranteed shot at a first job with IBM. We engaged before Charlottesville on this issue. We engaged after Charlottesville on the very same issue. In a different way, not on a president's advisory forum sitting in the state dining room having a meeting that's on camera, but we did continue to engage. Why? Because it's a policy issue we believe in. And we had results. 2 months ago, the president issued an infrastructure plan, and guess what that plan calls for? Reforming Pell Grants, expanding the federal work-study program, and sponsoring more schools like PTech, the one you saw in Connecticut. So engagement works. It's controversial, it's difficult, and there's not just one way to do it. But we believe that it works, and that's why we did it. Last example, September 5th, 2017, the Attorney General gets on TV and says the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, Dreamers, is being rescinded. Well, this was not especially surprising. We had known that it was coming. What was interesting was we found out we had 30 Dreamers who were IBM employees, 30 Dreamers. So what did we do? What would you do? Organize a lobbying campaign to preserve DACA? Announce that your company will become a safe haven for Dreamers in defiance of the law? File a lawsuit to prevent the rescission of DACA, or nothing? We have to comply with the law, whatever it is. Your last opportunity to tell me what you would have done in my shoes. Okay. Ooh, a lot of movement there. The answer is we did both, A and C. We organized a lobbying campaign with our Dreamers, and by the way, we worked with the Chamber of Commerce on that. Thank you, Chamber. And we brought Dreamers to Washington, and we did dozens of meetings on Capitol Hill with our Dreamers explaining their stories. We took videos of these people, and you can see this young woman back to the camera. Why is her back to the camera? Well, she doesn't want to get deported. But she was brave enough to come to Washington and meet with members of Congress and say, here's my story, and here's why I think I should stay. And we supported her in that. We also joined lawsuits to challenge the administration's removal of DACA, and I'm glad that we did, because the lobbying campaign so far hasn't worked, but the lawsuit did. Belts and suspenders. We did both in this case, hoping the lawsuit wouldn't be necessary, but it turned out to be. We thought Congress and the president might do the right thing. They were close to a deal at one point. The deal was there that the president said he wanted, wall money in exchange for fixing the DACA problem. Chuck Schumer was ready to make that deal. president was talked out of it by some people in the White House. He's now come back to that deal. That deal, you know, when you have a deal in Washington, there's a brief moment in time when it's there, and if you miss that moment, you're dead. So thank goodness we filed the lawsuit, but we're still working to try to get this fixed in legislation, and I believe eventually it will be. So I hope that gives you a sense. There are times when we agree with this administration, like on apprenticeships and new-collar jobs, and we work with them. There are times when we disagree, like on DACA, where we lobby against what they're trying to do. The basic guiding principle is that we'll engage based on our values, and we'll ask ourselves some questions on any issue. What's the impact on our business? What do our stakeholders expect us to do? And stakeholders is not shareholders. Those are one stakeholder, but stakeholders also includes employees, customers, and the general public. What's the impact on our values, our reputation, our history? What about the competition? What are they doing? And what precedent would it set for a global company if we did something or didn't do something? Those are the questions that we use when we get a curveball thrown at us by this administration or by any government around the world. There's no right answer. Sometimes you get it wrong. Sometimes you do both things. It doesn't have to be multiple choice, do only one of the above. But the basic point that we've tried to follow is that if you want to be a long-term company with a history beyond just 4 years or whatever the term of any government around the world is, you need to be able to engage, guided by values. And that's what we try to do. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here today. Now, I know I'm already a bit over time, but if there are any questions, comments, I'd be happy to take a couple.
Hi, I'm Bradley Dion. I'm a MBA student at Johns Hopkins. Real
Good
quick, I'd just
school.
like to hear your thoughts on how do you kind of, especially in these kind of moments of either a big change or a crisis, how do you kind of engage with the government in a way that doesn't come, and I guess the question would be, how do you walk that fine line of engagement without necessarily being seen as opportunist, as trying to either build your brand or secure some other type of deal. So I guess, how do you walk that line?
The best motto is, you can't make a friend when you need a friend. So if the first time they hear from you is when there's a crisis or a problem, and you come in and say, I got a great solution. Like, for example, on the travel ban, where some might say, oh, you were just being opportunistic, trying to sell your stuff, in order to deal with the travel ban. We actually had a previous relationship with General Kelly. We knew him when he was at Southcom. He was commander of U.S. Southern Command. And so I think if you've worked on building relationships before there's a crisis, you come off as less opportunistic. And that's hard work, but it's why engagement is so necessary. If you instead say, I'm not going to deal with these people, well, that may be fine today, but you have no idea what's going to come down the road a month from now or a year from now that may directly affect your business interests. And if you don't know these folks and you've refused to talk to them, you're in big trouble. And that's why we engage regardless of political party. It's why we don't have a political action committee. We're one of the few companies that doesn't. We don't give a dime of political money to anybody, and we never have. That was a founding principle of Tom Watson Sr., that old guy that you saw in the pictures. He didn't believe in it, and so we've never done it. And I actually think it's good. And the reason I think it's good is that when an earthquake happens, like last November, we could say, truly, we didn't have a candidate. We didn't support one or the other. We expected a certain result, like most people did, but we didn't have our CEO at one of the candidates' victory celebrations. If you go, almost none of IBM's senior executives give any personal political money. So I personally believe that if you want to play for the long term, and what you're really concerned about is the interests of your company and who you represent, being nonpartisan is absolutely essential. Anybody else? One last one, because I...
Hey, Chris. Joseph D'Antono, Johns Hopkins University as well. And I'd like to know a little bit about your career. So it says that you had worked for 10 years in business development, marketing, and government affairs before going into the public sector. So I'd like to know, how did you exactly make that transition? Because my understanding is that government affairs, it's largely based on pre-existing relationships that you have. So how'd you go from marketing and business development into that and then into the public sector?
I would say that my view on government affairs is it's actually not based on the relationships you have, but on your ability to build relationships. When I hire people, I don't want to hear them come in and tell me about their Rolodex or their contact list or how many people follow them on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn. What I want to know is, tell me about how you build a relationship with somebody you don't know. Give me an example. Because that's what I think is important. And so in my particular case, I worked at AT&T. I was doing international business development and sales. I was involved in some sales to government entities actually outside the United States that were controversial, and we needed the help of the US government with a particularly difficult sale in Europe. And somebody had to go to Washington and get the help of the Commerce Department and others, and I was the young guy on the team, and I was designated to do that. We did get the help of the government. We won the business. And I thought, well, that was kind of interesting. I enjoyed working on that. And so I asked for my next assignment to go to AT&T's Washington office. And that office had always looked for people with sales experience. Why? Because people who are good at sales typically are good at building relationships. And I just built relationships, and I've been in Washington now for almost 30 years. I chose to go into government in 2002, into the Bush 43 administration, because frankly, I wanted to see what it was like on the other side. I had been lobbying government, I had certain impressions, and I wanted to go in and learn what it was like to serve in government. And I did, and the thing that I learned lots of things, and I got to do some amazing things, and I had an incredible, wonderful 6 years in public service. The thing I learned the most, and this is especially true, is there's a tendency when you're outside of government to ascribe to government the conspiracy theory, to assume that everything government does is part of some carefully calculated larger plot. What I learned is that you should 98% of the time go with the chaos theory. And that's even more true today. People in government are human beings. They operate on the basis of not a whole lot of information. They don't have a huge amount of resources, and they have to make very hard decisions. And they do the best they can for the most part. Not all of them, but most of them. Most of the civil servants that I encountered, the career bureaucrats, were incredibly talented and hardworking people. There were some who were just lazy and collecting a paycheck until pension, but most not. And so I went in because I wanted to learn a few things, and I think it's helped me as I now try to deal with this very unpredictable situation. Okay. Well, I'm over time. I hope this was helpful to you. I hope that if you take anything away from this, it's that there's really no right answer when you're facing a tough situation. But you should always go into these questions guided by certain, what I call guidepost questions. And for us, engagement in engaging in a way that's consistent with values has been the basic guidepost. And we've tried to do that with every crisis that we've had. There will be other crises. This is a very unpredictable environment, and we're not going to get it right every time. But what we will do is try to use some basic ideas, some basic grounding principles to help get us through. And hopefully, that'll help us to not only survive, but thrive. And I hope that that works for you also in whatever career you choose next. Thanks very much.
Don't worry, darling. Baby, don't you fret. We're living in the future, and none of this has happened yet. Don't worry, darling.
I'm Julie Stitzel. I'm the Managing Director for the Chamber Technology Engagement Center, which is the tech policy hub of the U.S. Chamber. We've been around for about 3 years, and the goal of our work is to just really elevate the voice of technology when you're talking about business, and to advocate for policy solutions that preserve the facets of innovation in those conversations. So we collaborate with nearly every division within the U.S. Chamber, as you might expect. And if you don't think of technology when you think of the U.S. Chamber, you should, because we represent around 3 million small businesses. And as you know, as MBA folks, tech is driving business throughout the U.S. And so prior to my time at CTEC, I'm here just shy of 8 months, I was the Senior Manager of Advocacy and Policy for Etsy. And so I had a very similar role to the gentlemen who are joining me today, in that I was advocating for not just the company, but also Etsy sellers who were using the platform. And so we're going to spend, I think, the next 20 minutes talking about a topic that's already come up in previous panels, Techlash. But just to get a sense of the room, how many people tuned into the Facebook hearings this week? Great. And how many felt that Mr. Zuckerberg, affectionately called Zuckerman at one point, came out on top? Interesting. Okay, so that hearing is really at the crux of this conversation. Something that we've realized and have been talking about at CTEC is the changing nature of technology, not just with DC, but with the public sector. And so we're fortunate today to be joined by two people who are in the thick of it in DC. So Hugh Gamble is the Vice President of Federal Government Affairs for Salesforce. He has spent a significant amount of time on the Hill prior to his work at Salesforce. And I have to say that when I was a one-woman shop at Etsy, I believe Hugh was also a one-man shop at Salesforce. And so we often collaborated when we were having those tech meetings together. So it's good to see you, Hugh. Thanks for being here. And then AJ Bedelia is the manager for Google's public policy and government affairs team in DC, where he manages the relationships between Google and folks on Capitol Hill, as well as third-party organizations. And he is also a veteran of the Hill and has experience in the administration as well. So thank you to you both for being here. And we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to dive right in. Techlash. This is a term that was coined, I think, by The Economist last year. And I think it means different things to different people. And so just starting out and level setting for the folks in the room, when you hear that phrase, what does it mean to you, your company, but to the tech ecosystem as a whole?
I'll jump in first. I think to me, when I hear Techlash, what I basically hear is that the public policy world has started to finally look at the technology industry with a more critical eye. There was a significant honeymoon phase that seemed to be around the entire tech industry over the last, I'll just say, decade plus, since that was basically my time in DC. Technology was viewed mostly with the positive angles being emphasized in a policy side. It's not surprising, I think, to anybody to talk about the government being slow to address or recognize new technologies or the issues that arise out of those. But as technology has become a more prominent and prevalent part of our lives, whether that be in the workplace or in your personal life, it now impacts everybody. It's, you know, everybody's parents are on Facebook. Everybody's dealing with a multitude of systems at work. And so as issues start to become more public, that are worthy of conversation, the general positive vibe that existed around the technology industry as a homogenous group, which we are not, and that's sort of a byproduct of this conversation, is that people are realizing the differentiation between the companies and the business models, but you're having some more critical conversations, and those are important conversations. Those are conversations that are probably overdue, That doesn't mean that you have to act on every one of them, but it's just a more critical look at technology and how it impacts the daily lives of customers and citizens.
What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just double down on what Hugh just said, which is I think folks are looking at the role technology just plays in their lives. I mean, think about how much time you spend in front of a phone or a computer or anything else every day. And I think folks are asking very real questions about what is the role of technology in their lives. What is a fair amount of technology? What should regulation look like in the space as well? And I think folks are just they're asking questions, but as Hugh said, that doesn't mean you have to act on every single one of those impulses either.
And when you think about the techlash, and to your point, Hugh, that not every tech company is the same, but there's the potential to be perceived as the same. So one tech company is equivalent to the other, and so that makes the tech ecosystem fairly fragile. And so as you are connecting with legislators and you're trying to draw that distinction, this is how our company's working, this is how technology is advancing, or solving everyday problems. How are you injecting that element of resilience so it's not so fragile, and you can, what are some tools that you're using to educate legislators who might not get that nuance right away?
So, I mean, for me, it's a combination of things. One, it's about context. So, technology, I think we're spending a lot of time saying how tech is like no other sector out there. But in a certain respect, it is, right? When I was saying this in the back here, when Wells Fargo had its data security problems, they didn't call up Bank of America and start talking to them about it, right? And so it's a kind of a reminder that, one, there are different business models. We do different things. Google is not a social network, for one. That's a good example of that. And I think it's reminding folks that, beyond just technology, and technology permeates every part of our society, it's also within technology, there's just a wide variety of uses and use cases there. And I think it's slowly explaining to people, part of my job, the way I see it, is education, is really kind of spending a lot of time walking through what something is and what something isn't. And I think when you start at that base level, you can really start to create that separation.
And this is a good demonstration of the fact that there are different business models, because everybody woke up this morning using Google as a verb, and Salesforce, we have a completely different name ID and reputation and set of challenges that we face. We spend an awful lot of time, less so than we did 3 years ago when I started with the company, but certainly we spend a lot of time at the outset of meetings talking to policymakers about what it is that we do. Most of our customers we're a B2B company primarily. And so our customers are other chamber members or large companies to small businesses, but members don't necessarily know what we are. And so to your point, there's an educational element to this. I end up using an awful lot of anecdotal customer examples of how we've implemented solutions for people to try to help them understand and then connect those to the policy issues that are being presented in whatever context the conversation's happening. But the simple answer is the industry is generally relatively young, and especially when you talk about the internet industry as a portion of tech. IBM, before us, obviously is over a century old. They're an outlier in the tech industry. They're a great partner of Salesforce, as is Google, but that's an exception, I think, in the tech space. And so these members, by and large, just by virtue of the generation that most of them are a part of, don't naturally have a tech knowledge. And so we find ourselves really spending a lot of time focusing on the educational piece of this. And to echo what Chris said, I think you've got to do that proactively. Because if you're doing it once the issues arise, you're really trying to turn the aircraft carrier as opposed to getting it pointing in the right direction from the outset out of port.
I was just saying, I do want to add on about the customer piece here. I think it's very important to showcase the way people are using your products, right? And how that is different, or how that might be similar as well. Think about how you use Google on a daily basis. Typically, in our mission statement, right, is to organize the world's information and to make it universally accessible and useful. And so the way we see it is people use our platform to get information. And so that's how we build our products. That's how we expect to be regulated in a certain respect as well, because that's kind of the discussions that we have and the way that we build our products in a way.
I remember when I was at Etsy, I could tell within the first 5 seconds when I was meeting with a member if they knew what it was or they didn't. And so I'm just curious really quick, are there any members who don't know what Google is?
I mean, I think it's certainly become popular enough to the fact that most folks know what it is. I don't know that many members know exactly how it spits out the results, or the different other products that we have. Not everyone uses Gmail, not everyone uses Google Maps, or Android or things like that as well. So I think they know the company just like any other large company in the United States, and they may know 1 or 2 products that it does. But the challenge still is very similar. It's reminding folks, here's the way people use their products, and it's not necessarily what they always think.
One of the things we were talking about in a previous panel is the role of the DC team, the government relations team, and how potentially, given the events of this week, that has elevated for folks in the tech industry. But can you talk a little bit about that? So I think you are 2 very different companies and sizes of your government relations teams as well. What are some of the challenges that you faced when you're interfacing maybe with folks who are not within your company, who are not as familiar with how DC works, and what are some tactics that you've used to educate them to say, here's why you need to pay attention? And for your just frame of reference, we actually had a gentleman here showing a slide that it actually impacts bottom line, and so you can use data to make that case, but at the end of the day, you're having conversations internally. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think that's exactly right, is you've got to have a fundamental understanding with your C-suite and your senior executives that what goes on in DC, and we're both Northern California-based companies, I think there is a tendency with the geographic difference and the culture differences to be very frustrated at times with DC and want to throw your hands up. But the moment they truly understand the impact of the bottom line, they realize this is not an optional function. It's one that is core to the business. And I imagine Google has had that realization far before Salesforce, but it's one that, I mean, just to be completely honest, you can't have debates around things like corporate tax reform without everybody having that realization. Because that's a scary moment. If you're not in the position to be prepared for that conversation, to make sure that your ox is not going to be the one that's gored, your executives are going to all of a sudden wish they had seen the value of the function. So I think you have to point out along the way and remind them that the price of being a part of those conversations is sometimes being in DC and making sure that you're aware of everything that's going on, regardless of how frustrated they may be with it or how much they may wish that they didn't have to pay attention to it. And that's easier to do if you're in a bubble in Northern California, but our job is to make sure that we pop that bubble as often and as loudly as we possibly can to make them aware.
Yeah, I mean, the general policy that we take here in DC is, what's good for the internet will eventually be good for Google. And I think the internet is ubiquitous to the economy and people's lives now at this point, right? And so, if somebody is creating content in Michigan and somebody watches it in Germany, they're now a net exporter in trade, right? And so, I mean, it's a great example of the range of issues that you have to think about on a daily basis. What does a tech company that's based in Northern California care about those things? Well, there is a host of different examples I could give you about why we get involved in a wide range of issues here. And, I think folks, by and large, at our company at this point, I think recognize why it's so valuable to be involved in these debates, partially because, as we've said prior to this, it's about education. And if you don't have the people on the ground here explaining, why that trade context is important, or why, these tax issues are important, why, making sure that, you're allowing for free speech on platforms is important, you're not going to be able to create those kind of situations in which you're doing smart regulation, smart lawmaking.
I would imagine there's some folks wondering how you got where you are. If you were on the Hill, why did you pick tech, or what attracted you to the tech industry? But also, do you think that it's necessary to have that Hill experience if you are going to be a government affairs professional? And if you don't need it, what are some things that you absolutely do need?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's government affairs and public policy at a company is inherently very different than being in government. So, I spent more than a decade in government. I worked on the Hill, worked for the Obama administration. And you certainly do, just being in this town and being able to, just kind of absorb knowledge and absorb different contexts and how folks react in those contexts, and being in the middle of it is very helpful, of course. I think having the ability to know how things were done in the past, how things should be done in the future, or can help guide how you do things in the future. So in that respect, it's very, very helpful. But it's very different. Times are changing, as we're noting here in this entire panel, and they require different tactics too. So it also requires someone who's willing to be creative, who's willing, to think through, what are the broader set of challenges we're dealing with, and what has worked in the past, and if it hasn't worked in the past, what are new ways we can engage here as well.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all of that. I will add that I don't think that working in government is naturally a prerequisite. It is helpful, and my time was all spent. It was just over a decade in the Senate, and having a perch from which to watch the House and the Senate and understand those institutions, you can study them to your heart's content, and you won't truly understand them unless you have really been in that arena to study them, because it's more of a living, breathing ecosystem that's impacted by 535 personalities. And you need to understand why things happen, not just that they happened. That's not to say that you can't have people within an organization that have different skill sets. But I think it is an enormously helpful tool to have on your belt. But Chris mentioned in his previous panel that being able to build relationships is key, and he's absolutely right. The Hill is such a transient place that if all you have is existing relationships, you're going to be obsolete in 2 years. So you have to be able to develop new relationships in positions that are important, and that's the key I would add to what Chris said is you need to be able to spot who are the people that I need to have those relationships with. This is the portfolio of issues that I care about. Who are going to be the influencers and policymakers, stakeholders that really influence those issues, and you need to have those ongoing existing relationships. And you can tell you've been successful if they reach out to you before they start drafting something that's relevant to that issue. That is really the metric for success in this, is that they think of you before they step on your toes.
They want to know your opinion.
That's it.
So with emerging tech, CTEC works on a host of issues, autonomous vehicles, drones, the new economy, gig economy, and there's as much of a state play as there is a federal play on that. How do you stay on top of that? And do you harmonize efforts at the state and federal level? Do you see states as unique actors and respect? How does that work within Google and Salesforce?
I'll start, and it's going to be probably a different answer here because I think this goes to your point about the size of our teams.
Yeah.
Salesforce, from a global perspective, has 16 people, 17 soon, I think, if our international team makes a hire that they're expected to, working on issues. We've got a state and local team, but the issues, more so recently, the issues that state legislatures have started to take on are nationally impactful issues, because if you have a state, and often it's New York or California tend to lead on tech issues, if they take an action, it tends to be something that ripples across all the other states, because we don't really just function within one state. And so we find ourselves, if Congress at the federal level fails to act on something, all of a sudden a state legislator gets an idea, yes, you have to coordinate. Sometimes that's just for expediency, so that you're not reinventing the wheel and you can help each other with the conversations that have already happened inside the company. But yeah, they are different teams, but we have to lock arms and have those conversations about, if the federal government's not going to do a national effort to preempt states doing it, you're going to end up potentially with an awful lot of patchwork laws across the country that are problematic. It becomes a common denominator type of situation.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. States are the tip of the spear in a certain respect now in terms of policy making, particularly as Congress If it fails to act in certain areas, I think states certainly are more willing to take those actions. And for Google's part, our state policy team, and we have, I think we have offices around the country, in places you wouldn't expect. And so we certainly have folks who work in those offices. We have folks in DC who kind of manage those folks within those offices as well. But the key point is that they sit on the same team as I do, the same sub-team in kind of outreach issues, because basically what you'll see in the state, at some point you may see on the federal level as well, or vice versa. And so I think it's very important to stay coordinated, because if you don't, you're not, it's a crystal ball in a certain respect, and it'd be criminal not to do that.
So we only have a few more seconds, and bringing it back to Techlash, tech hasn't been in this place before, so this is new terrain, which is familiar because a lot of tech companies forge this new pathway for industries. Where do you think we're going to be in 5 years? Better off? More regulated? What do you think?
Yeah, so look, technology, we're a resilient industry. We're still going to be here, newsflash. I don't think that will be the problem. I certainly think, look, folks are still figuring out, as we said at the top of this segment, the role of technology in their lives, right? And they're going to continue to ask very serious and real questions. And I happen to think that we are already very regulated. If you look at the list of industries and the patchwork of regulation that they have versus kind of where tech is with the FTC versus with state level regulation versus the whole host of other kind of federal agencies that we deal with on a daily basis as well. I think part of it is harmonizing that. I think folks are wanting to figure out how do these current rules fit in place with what they see technology going and moving forward. And I think that's what we'll see in the next 5 years, which is a desire to possibly give the FTC more enforcement authority, right? Or having more of a discussion around what should consumer protection look like in this space as well.
I think that's it. And look, the reality is there's certainly going to be more of a legislative focus on potentially regulating the technology industry. I saw during the hearings this week with Facebook and Mr. Zuckerberg that the question was asked, are you in favor of being regulated? Are you in favor of privacy regulation? And to me, it's kind of an absurd question, because the devil is very much in the details. It's not a matter of, are you willing? It's like asking someone in a different industry, do you like your set of regulations and laws? Well, you're going to have to be a little more specific than that. And so I think that we're certainly willing to enter those conversations. And look, as ubiquitous as tech is becoming in people's lives, privacy concerns, I understand them. And that's why we as a company focus, our number one pillar of priority is trust. And it's from an enterprise perspective, if we've got a company's data, making sure that they know that's their data, no one else is seeing it, we're not looking at it, we're going to protect it to the death. And that's just a fundamental tenet of where things need to be. I think that the industry needs to focus on regaining trust. And if they can do that, I think a lot of some of these pressures that have arisen to regulate may alleviate a little bit. But we're going to have to enter that conversation and earn that trust. It's not something that's going to be given.
I think everybody, sorry.
I was just saying, just to put a tail end on that, I wholeheartedly agree. I think there is the interesting thing about the technology sector is we're always competing against each other, right? If you do not like Google.com, there are a dozen other search engines. People joke about Bing, but Bing has 33% of the US search market. And so there are alternatives there. And if folks do not feel comfortable, if they don't feel like we can be trusted, they have alternatives. And Hugh's point, I want to bullet point that, put an exclamation point on it. That is the number one thing we think about on a daily basis is, at Google, we don't sell your data. At Google, we are extremely careful on these issues because we understand that if we are not, you have alternatives. And I think that's key. I think folks have to remember that that's what the technology industry is, and that's what it was born out of, that competition, and that's what it's going to look like in the next 5 years, too.
That's great. So I want to leave some time for questions. Are there questions out there? We can keep the conversation going. No questions.
Really, guys?
I know.
Hi, my name is Joe Krasinskis from George Mason University. As tech continues to get farther and farther ahead of common knowledge with technologies like deep learning, blockchain, do you have a strategy on how you're going to continue to keep folks who aren't tech specialists like your companies are to stay informed and realize the potential success or devastation that can be caused by those?
I'll jump in first. I think the tech industry, though we're not homogenous, we do realize that we have to be very proactive on that front. That's why people like CTEC here at the Chamber are so important to help us with that proactive educational effort. You've seen just in the last 18 months or so, caucuses or groups pop up in the House and the Senate focused around some of the emerging technologies you're talking about, a blockchain caucus, an AI caucus, an IoT caucus. And those are members that are interested in the issues, and it provides us a forum to continue to educate them. And I think that one of the goals that we have when you talk about these emerging technologies is to make sure that there isn't a reflexive fear of them that causes regulation, that stifles innovation. And a lot of that comes through an understanding of what is really going on. We've got a lot of AI tools baked into what we're selling right now, but it's the furthest thing from being scary. It's this is an Arnold Schwarzenegger type AI. This is us predicting, telling you what out of your list of 200 sales leads, being able to pick the 5 that you're going to be able to close the easiest. It's really helpful things, but it's nothing to be afraid of. And it goes back to education. But we are doing the right things of setting up those forums to have those conversations proactively and in a condensed way with people that are interested and hopefully going to be the people that help shape where policymakers go on these issues.
It is absolutely about capacity building, and it's about supporting organizations and institutions that can provide that knowledge and that kind of support. So whether it's the Chamber, or it's various nonprofits and think tanks around the city that do a whole host of deep thinking on those issues that you just mentioned, or supporting programs that help bring smart tech policy staff to the Hill, right? And I think one of the things that we have seen, particularly over the last 10 years on Capitol Hill, is a real brain drain of staff, right? I mean, as salaries have gone lower, as folks have kind of moved on, you don't, and I really commend those people that have stayed up there because they do incredible work for so little pay at this point. And I think it's supporting those people. I think it's creating those programs. It's creating outlets for them to go to and learn in those areas. I think that's where you're going to be able to build those places for people to connect and really think about the technologies of tomorrow.
Other questions? One of the things we didn't get to touch on, and I'm glad we have a little more time to do so, is the positive aspects of technology. When you think about Techlash, the negative narrative tends to overshadow what's the good things that are happening. And it's not to be Pollyannish about, there are serious concerns or anxieties that folks are having, but to Hugh's point on AI, or whether you're talking about blockchain, those innovations are permeating multiple industries. So if you look at health, AI is making medical teams more efficient, IoT is making diagnoses more efficient, lowering cost of care. We were talking about ag tech and farming, and how farmers are using autonomous tractors, they're using drones, and so there's a whole narrative around the positive aspects of tech, and I think it shifts it away from technology companies and more about how is technology being used to solve problems that everyday Americans are facing. So what's happening between the coasts. And so we're, at CTEC, we're focusing on these issues, but we're also leveraging the expertise and the efforts of the Googles and the Salesforces of the world to help tell that story, because a lot of times when we're bringing it back to Techlash, we're losing those stories. And to your point of trust, I mean, even though we aren't necessarily in this fragile ecosystem, potentially not, I hope we're not, if you don't trust the tech and all of the industries are becoming more tech reliant, then we're gonna have a problem. And so it was funny, a question that we often get asked is people talk about the trust and the privacy and why don't companies care about the privacy of the data? They absolutely do, because if it's not private and if the consumers don't trust it, they're not going to use the technology, and then the companies don't exist. So I would, not to speak for you, but I think overall narrative of the companies that we are able to work with at CTEC, that is a top priority, because at the end of the day, you need consumer adoption to help these innovations thrive. So, any other questions? Yes.
Given that that privacy is a top priority, and I think we heard that in the Zuckerberg interviews as well, why is privacy becoming such an issue with companies and such a prevalent issue? We hear about it with the government getting hacked. We hear about it with Facebook. So what do you think is the cause of that?
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think that some of it is that just as, and I use the word ubiquitous again, as tech is, every company is now a tech company. That's I think part of the reason that the Chamber is becoming such an important tool for the technology industry is that it's not just tech companies in the way that you think about it, that you care about these issues now. Every company is a tech issue. Any type of policy conversation around this applies to the more traditional companies in every industry. Because that is true, I think there are more conversations that are happening. I think the frequency with which people are aware of data breaches is increasing. It's getting covered more. And those things tend to feed on themselves from a PR perspective, but it's a very real concern. And it's, you get into things, industries that essentially have those issues, companies that have had those issues, they have a crisis of trust. And it becomes a situation where you look at those, and candidly for us, we're a pure cloud company, which means if you've got your data with us, we are hosting it, and we're the ones providing that security. That's an existential issue for us. And so if we lose that trust, it's a subscription service, you can move on to the next guy, one of our competitors. And so it becomes a situation where we are going to make that investment that's necessary to make sure that we have data as secure and as protected as is humanly possible to earn that trust. And I think that that's where you're going to see things go, is companies are very slowly evolving on this issue where they're realizing that their IT department and their IT security isn't just a supporting function, it's a core tenet to their business and their relationship with their customers, and it all goes back to trust. If you don't have that, people will go elsewhere. And we think that's a selling point for our product. I'm not trying to make a sales pitch, I'm not in sales, but it's if we can't secure your data better than you probably can on site, then good for you. But the reality is we think it's a core competency that we possess to secure data. And especially when we're talking about selling into the public sector and government's really not good at those types of things like IT security. And so as someone whose data was a part of the OPM hack a few years ago, and you probably were as well, I really do wish that they would hurry up and adopt more private solutions and go to people that have the best talent in the world securing that data. It's a long answer and it's a long way around, but I think it all goes back to trust. And it's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be short here because I know we're running out of time, but privacy and security has been something I think folks have been thinking about for a long time in the back of their heads, whether you're an everyday consumer, you're a person who works in the field. I don't think this is new. I think what's new is it went from the back of people's heads to something very much in the forefront, partially because some of the flashpoints have happened and some of the incidents have occurred as well. And I think folks have realized that, every time you swipe your credit card, if you have those settings in your credit card company, that information is being shared, right? So it isn't just the tech industry, right? It's your cable company, it's the grocery store down the street. I mean, it is. I mean, think about the kinds of data uses that are done, and oftentimes for the improvement of products. I'm not saying this is some like vacuum of data that's happening here, but folks are asking, where is that data going? How are people handling it? The way I see Google's role is we've been doing this for a long time. We have been in the tech industry, and working and thinking through these issues, and we've fought some of these battles 10 years ago. And so for us, it's about how do you lead? How do you help set standards? How do you provide support on the security side of this? One of the big initiatives we're doing right now is particularly around specific hardware-focused two-factor authentication. Because I think we can do that, and we can have those conversations, and people will listen. So I think it's as much about leadership than anything else.
And I think we could talk about this all day, so we appreciate the time, but unfortunately we got to get some other speakers up here. But please join me in thanking AJ and Hugh for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Hi everyone, I'm Laura Lane. I'm President of Global Public Affairs for UPS, and I have to give you guys a shout out because I swear I wished when I started out my career I would have gotten an MBA. It would have been so helpful to me at the beginning of my career. So I'm going to be talking today about matching your mission with your work. I started out my career in the Foreign Service. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of the story of how my career started out because it has very much shaped the aspirations that I have for every role I've been in since then. So I grew up in Des Plaines, Illinois, and I was never going to sell out to the man. I was never going to work for corporate America. I was going to go into the Foreign Service and be on the front lines of diplomacy, trying to bring world peace and safety and stability. And I really believed that I could accomplish that. I got my undergrad at Loyola and got my graduate degree at Georgetown in the Foreign Service, and ended up being one of the youngest women ever admitted into the Foreign Service. And you better believe I wanted to prove something. I thought, you know what? I'm going to show them a woman can accomplish anything just like a man in the Foreign Service. And so I raised my hand and I said, absolutely, send me to Bogota, Colombia. I went to Bogota, Colombia in 1990 from 1992. Have any of you guys seen the show Narcos? Yeah, I know Javier Peña, and he wasn't that handsome. He was a little bit chubbier, and but I served at the American Embassy there at the height of the drug violence and felt like I was making a difference. We were trying to help the government try to find a way to get control of the territory back from the guerrillas and take the country back from the drug traffickers, and I was inspired. And I was ready for my next challenge. And so, being as worldly as I was, I said, you know what? I want to learn another language. I already spoke Spanish. It'd be so helpful to learn French. And there on the list was Kigali, Rwanda. And I'm like, okay, flipping through my geography book, going, now where is Kigali again? Oh, that's in East Africa. I get to get 6 months of French training. Sign me up. I'll be the everything else officer at the American Embassy there, and I'll get the opportunity to make a difference. And I really went into that mission believing that. I knew that the government had just signed the Arusha Peace Accords, which was to end the fighting between the Hutu and the Tutsis. And I thought, awesome, this is going to be an amazing opportunity for me to really make a difference. I'll be the officer that goes in and do consular, economic, and political military affairs. Who cares that I don't know the difference between a general and a sergeant and whatever? I'll figure it out along the way. And so I landed in Kigali, Rwanda in August of 1993. I got a couple pictures to share with you. Yeah, I kind of stood out like a sore thumb. The responsibility that I predominantly had was serving as the embassy officer that would cross the DMZ and meet with General Kagame up in the north to try to begin the trust building that was needed to begin bringing Kagame's predominantly Tutsi forces down from the north into the capital in Kigali. And as you can imagine, when you can see from this picture, I got a couple others that you'll love, I know. I'm wearing a suit in the middle of like fourth world country, but you know what? I was about making sure that they knew that I had the authority to be there, and my job was to make sure that we brought the two forces together. It was a little bit challenging because One, I knew nothing about the military, and everybody knew that. Two, I was a woman, and I was 25 years old. The rebel forces weren't too happy when I crossed the DMZ and they met me for the very first time because they were insulted. They thought, why aren't we meeting with the ambassador? Why aren't you sending a senior level official to engage with us? And it was a real challenge in the early days of developing that trust between myself and each of the rebel forces, as well as the Hutu army forces that I had to work with. But I was able to succeed over time. I spent a lot of time trying to win their trust, and I did it in quintessentially unusual ways. I couldn't talk military talk with most of them. I knew what I had to accomplish, and I knew I had to bring them together, and I did it grandma's way. I did it through food. I baked banana bread, I baked brownies. Every time I crossed the DMZ, I would hand out food, because the first couple times they'd make me get on my knees and hold a gun to my head and say, why are you going to meet with, General Kagame up in the north? He's evil, and make all their comments along the way. But you know what? A secret trick in a fourth world country, bring food and everybody starts to love you. The rebels up in the north, for sure, eating what they were, which was not, packaged MREs that the U.S. military has on hand, were always grateful to see me. And little by little, I started building that trust. Enough so that on the right and left of me are the Hutu and rebel force commanders. I'm sitting there with General Dallaire, who you see right up there on the left with the binder on his lap. Sitting and talking about what it would take to reestablish those bonds of trust so that the Arusha Peace Accords could be fully implemented. And I got to earn the trust and support of General Kagame. All of that was really important because you all have read your history books and you know on April 6, 1994, President Habyarimana's plane was shot down. And in the next 24 hours and the 3 months that unfolded, the genocidal plotters basically ensured that almost 1 million people were killed in 3 months' time. I was at the American Embassy when all of this happened, and it was probably one of the most life-changing experiences for me that I could ever have imagined. I had joined the Foreign Service because I wanted to save the world, and instead I became firsthand witness to genocide. And I can promise you that was incredibly life-changing. But there were really important lessons I learned, and I'm going to share them with you because they made all the difference for me in terms of what I did next. I am not someone who has ever been about climbing the corporate ladder to achieve the heights in my career, because you go through an experience like Rwanda and you experience that firsthand, it changes everything. I was responsible for making it through the lines of fighting and beginning the negotiations of the ceasefires to try to get every single American out alive. We had over 250 Americans in Rwanda at the time, spread out all over the country. I knew where every single one of them was, because it was my job to be the consular officer and to be there as an American Citizen Services representative, so that wasn't a problem. My challenge came, though, when the U.S. government gave me very clear instructions. Before they ordered the embassy to shut down, they said, your responsibility is to get out only Americans. You need to check passports. By the way, any allies are welcome, but any Rwandans you need to turn away. 25 years old, I had just turned 26. Can you imagine that responsibility? Like, people are coming to the embassy with their kids in hand saying, please just take my daughter. They're going to kill her, and I'm not going to make it out alive. Please find safety for her. It was the most incredibly challenging experience that I've ever been through. Because you know what I thought? I thought to myself, you know what? If I don't follow orders, I'll never rise to the rank of ambassador at the State Department. I'll never be considered for any future promotions. Shouldn't I just follow orders? At that very moment, I learned that the most important thing in life sometimes isn't just to always follow the rules. I can't go into as many of the details, and I actually did a TED Talk on it about when to follow your heart and make your own rules. Because in that situation, I learned the greatest thing you can do as a decision maker is follow your heart, follow your principles, and think about the people first, not about the process or the hierarchy above you. I made the decision at that moment in time that future promotions be damned. I don't get to make that decision that I get to live because I was born in Des Plaines, Illinois, and all the other folks that happen to be born in Mulindi get to die. I decided to make my own rules. Rather than checking passports, I issued transportation letters. Anybody we could smuggle in our convoys overland out to the south, to Burundi, I made them all honorary Americans. We didn't even save half as many people as we needed to, but I learned a very important lesson that sometimes you have to make the decisions that are right by your heart rather than just going along with the flow because someone above has told you to do something that in your heart you know isn't exactly the right thing to do in that given situation. From that moment on, I've lived a life of deep regret. I have to tell you that because we actually did close down the embassy. I left notes on the desks of every one of my staff. I had 13 Rwandans who worked for me. I evacuated out to Burundi. It took me 3 months' time to get the authority to go back in and reopen the embassy. And you know, when I got back, I found out that none of those notes had ever been read. Every one of my Rwandan staff had been executed in the first week because they were on the list of those plotting the genocide. They were on the list because they'd worked by my side. They were on the list because we were trying to implement the Arusha Peace Accords, and that is not what those that were plotting the genocide wanted to see come about. And I have lived with that greatest grief and regret, and I will to the rest of my life, because I didn't do enough to go and find them and save them. But we did save those that we could. That lesson has shaped everything I've done since then. For me, every decision is crystal clear. You think about the people first, you think about the principles that you hold in your heart, and then you follow your heart. You follow that passion that's going to drive you to make that right decision. And from there, I have had a career that has been guided by those 3 principles. And I share them with you because sometimes when you're working in corporate America, there's a lot of pressure put on you to just do what you're told or to follow that process or to make that decision because it'll get you a little bit more money. But I would urge you, make the right decision that takes into account people and those principles and where your heart is. I have done exactly that. I have tried to take every role that I've been in since and figure out a way to achieve the purpose of the role that I'm in while at the same place, and I know it's going to sound incredibly Pollyannish, but how to make the world a better place along the way. So this is a picture actually in my current role now. I joined UPS 7 years ago. I was one of the first outside hires brought in and kind of changed the culture because it's always been a promote from within culture. And it's a culture of people who've been with the organization starting from the ground up. And I really needed to come in and win everybody's trust because I was the outsider coming in. But what I knew about UPSers is UPSers are the kind of people that they work in that network, and in a network, everybody's got to be all in together. Everybody's got to help each other out because you don't get the package delivered if someone drops the ball somewhere along the chain or within the network. And I knew that in order to create that same kind of loyalty for what I wanted us to accomplish through UPS in our mission, I needed to find a way to bring the team together. And so I chose the opportunity of building a health clinic in Bosencheve, Mexico. I chose the opportunity of saying to my entire international team, and let me tell you, some of these folks are, you know, they work behind desks every day, telling them, hey, you're gonna pick up a circular saw and you're gonna be doing some paneling or siding on a building. We're gonna have you painting, we're gonna have you outside your comfort zone, but we're gonna do something great together in a community that UPS doesn't deliver to. We're going to do something to make the world a better place just because we're UPSers and we can, and we have the resources and the opportunity to. Why? Because we are about leveraging our network to deliver good wherever we can. We have a huge healthcare component to our operations, and why don't we show that we don't just deliver what is needed to bring great health, but we also deliver possibilities in communities that don't even have access to healthcare. And so my team back in 2013 built this amazing clinic in Bosancheve, Mexico. We worked for 7 days from the ground up and created this clinic. And it was probably one of the most inspiring moments for our team. And it was that effort where we all came together that earned their trust. And now we've been accomplishing even more great things together. I didn't know how to use a circular saw either, but I'm a big believer in never tell yourself what you can't do, just tell yourself what you need to learn next. And so I had a lot of fun doing that, as you can tell. Fast forward now, I'm serving on the President's Advisory Council for Doing Business in Africa. What an amazing opportunity now to be able to go back to that continent that has probably been one of the sources of my deepest regrets, right? When you think about what allowed genocide to take place in a country, it's lack of education, it's fear, it's a turn to the military rather than a turn to economic opportunity. And I thought to myself, you know, how can you be a change agent in a continent where you were the firsthand witness to genocide? How can I be that agent for change, for making things better? I heard Chris Padilla talk about, you know, a lot of that angst that went into people who were on advisory councils about what do? Do you stay on after some of the statements that were made at in Charlottesville about the Charlottesville incident? You know what? I didn't even think twice about that. I thought, you know what? I'm the kind of person that stays, that delivers a perspective, and hopefully changes minds, because if you're not at the table, then only one side is being told. I was going to make sure I stayed at that table to talk about the important issues that needed to be addressed on the African continent, and that the U.S. needed to engage, because it's only through economic opportunity and education that a lot of the lives of the people living across many of these countries in the sub-Saharan African continent can be changed. And the U.S. has the ability to engage through the business community to make that difference. And so I took it firsthand. This is a picture of me actually volunteering in Swaziland. I chose Swaziland because Swaziland is a country where women have zero rights. Most of the country is struggling with HIV/AIDS and TB, just like I had experienced in Rwanda. So many children are orphaned. The king does not allow for children to be adopted. And so a lot of children are abandoned on the roadside. And UPS has been actively involved in an orphanage in Swaziland run through Heart for Africa. And I decided to put a lot of my personal time and energy, as well as my team's time and energy, in supporting this particular orphanage and doing work to make a difference in the lives of these children. This is one of my favorite pictures because look at their faces. They have so much possibility in them, and yet, you know what? If they aren't educated, they aren't clothed, they aren't fed, they become the next generation of child soldier recruits for whatever other army that's gonna, you know, rampage across, you know, any of these countries. And I thought, you know what? You can talk the talk, but you gotta walk the walk. You gotta be in there making a difference. And I'm really proud of the fact that UPS gives me and my team the opportunity to engage in organizations like this, to be that force of change, so that this next generation might be the future leaders of Swaziland, that might grant women the rights that would make that country so much stronger, that wouldn't leave kids orphaned and abandoned by the side of the road, but would find ways to provide economic opportunity and education for them. And I'm proud of the fact that UPS is part of that force for change. I'm going to end with one story that's been very, very powerful for me, and how I've been able to match my mission with the work that I'm doing. So as you can imagine, going back to Rwanda was almost impossible for me. I suffered from post-traumatic stress just because of everything that I witnessed. Seeing any human being hacked to death is probably the most unsettling thing you can ever experience. And it's something that you can't really process, right? Because you don't have the ability to connect that inhumanity to another person. And obviously because of the tremendous guilt, having had so many of my staff killed. But I was convinced by UPS I needed to return. I actually had the opportunity just 3 years ago to go back to Rwanda. And I got to see General Kagame, now President Kagame again. And I'm going to share with you the cool thing that I got to do. UPS has launched the only commercial drone service in the world. You haven't read a lot about it in the papers because UPS is a very humble company. We went to Rwanda and launched a drone service, and we are now doing daily deliveries through drone of blood to the clinics across the country. We are saving lives because you know what most people die of in Rwanda and across sub-Saharan Africa? They die from limited access to blood. You can't trust the blood supply because most people are HIV positive, and a lot of women, as you can imagine, giving birth, die from postpartum hemorrhaging. Can you imagine being a mother giving birth and being told, I'm sorry, you're not going to see your child's next breath because we don't have the blood to be able to save your life? UPS is now using drones to deliver blood in 15 minutes or less, and we are saving lives left and right. And I'm so proud of the fact that we took that service to a place that I promise you UPS wasn't operating in. We didn't have extensive deliveries, but it was that wonderful intersection of President Kagame having the vision to say, I would like to have the ability to use new technology and innovation to be able to deliver for my people. Can I work with you, Zipline and Gavi, to come up with something that isn't being done anywhere in the world? And UPS said yes. And I had the opportunity to go back. And this time when I saw General Kagame, I wasn't apologizing about the fact that the US government had failed to intervene, to strengthen the rules of engagement for the UN forces that were there for peacekeeping. This time I got to say, I'm here bringing a service that is delivering good, and I'm proud that UPS is the one bringing it. And so with that, that's the story that I wanted to share with you, because it's really important that as you move up in corporate America and use your MBAs to really create economic opportunity and new possibilities that never existed, never lose your foundation in terms of doing everything to make the world better for the people that are in it, following your principles and not selling out just to make a little bit more money or climb the corporate ladder, and find that passion in you to take that intersection of what great companies can do and use it to deliver real good. So with that, thank you very much.
Thunder, feel the thunder. Lightning and the thunder. Thunder, feel the thunder. Lightning and the thunder. Thunder, thunder. Thunder. Kids were laughing in my classes.
Logically, it's important that programs have flow. And so, of course, we're now going to talk about sports betting, because that's the perfect transition from the fact that we're all crying from Laura's presentation, right? And I do hope that one of the things you're going to take away today is how often your own personal mission and the contributions you want to make in the world can be made through business. And as I said in the opening, it's one of the reasons we think business is such a noble calling. We've talked today about government advocacy, particularly in the states. We've talked about government advocacy at the federal level. We've talked about two of the branches, the White House, the administration, and secondly, we've talked about the Congress. We haven't talked a lot about the third branch, which is the courts. And so we want to do that a little bit today with my friend and one of the best association executives in town, Jeff Freeman, who runs the American Gaming Association. And so Jeff, welcome. Thank you for being here. Can you say a quick word about what the Gaming Association does?
Sure. So the American Gaming Association represents all aspects of the U.S. casino industry. So all those brands you know and love from Las Vegas and Las Vegas Sands, MGM, Caesars, Wynn, all the regional casino companies around the country. And in recent years, we've brought in the tribal casinos as well, because when you see that there are now nearly 1,000 casinos in 40 states across the US, about half of those are tribal, half of those are commercial. We're all working together along with those that make the slot machines and the other aspects of the industry to figure out how we both protect the industry and how we find some opportunities for growth in the years ahead.
Associations are interesting jobs. Well, Jeff and I think that because we work in them. But generally, you need business people, right? Because what Jeff just described is what's happening with the industry. And then you need people who understand PR, communications, advocacy, because that's your job. So starting with the first, Jeff, how is your industry changing? What's happening inside of gaming?
So our industry isn't changing enough. When you go to a casino today, how many of you have been to a casino in recent days, recent months? It probably doesn't look a whole heck of a lot different than it looked when your parents went in the 80s. You've got slot machines all over. You're not pulling the thing anymore, you're pressing a button, but the machines aren't that much different. You got these tables over here, they're not that much different. And a big reason for that is that as our industry expanded beyond Nevada and New Jersey, each of these other states said, well, we want to get all the money that casinos can offer, but we kind of want to plug our nose. We're worried about the negative effects the industry might have, so we'll put these crazy tax rates, these crazy restrictions on how they operate, and we'll really kind of lock the industry in time. And we're locked 20, 25, 30 years ago. We need to change. We need to attract new customers. We need to be more interactive. We need to, you walk around a casino and you're carrying chips. Well, who carries cash, let alone chips anymore, right? Everyone operates in a cashless world. We need to figure out how we get there. So I fear that we're behind the times. We're handicapped to a degree by regulation, the law that's out there, but we need to seek some progress and innovation pretty quickly.
So talk about the role a trade association plays, right? So you're talking about the change you need to see in your industry. What's your job, your team's job in that?
So the role we play, I think, and not just for AGA, for trade associations around town, the role we play has changed significantly from what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. 20 years ago, there was a great mystery as to what was happening in Washington. And a lot of the decisions that got made were made in the dark of night in smoke-filled rooms, and you had to have access to those rooms to be able to influence outcomes. Washington's a much more transparent place today. There isn't a lot of mystery to what's going on. A lot of it's more predictable. And it's less about access today, and it's more about how you can make your case for your industry, how you can put yourself on a crowded map of all of the other issues that they may need to address, and that's where we're focused. We've transitioned from playing defense and trying to prevent bad things from happening by being in those smoke-filled rooms to being much more outwardly focused, telling our industry's story, realizing that perception drives policy, so we need to ensure that the perception of our industry is as strong as it could possibly be. And we're also looking for opportunities that Washington could help us grow our business. What are some obstacles that if Washington removed could create multi-billion-dollar opportunities? That's a new way, I think, for most industries to look at Washington, not just as a threat, but as a significant opportunity.
I think that's really interesting. I wish we had more. I want to go back. I'll buy a drink later. I want to hear more about that. But in this group, one of the things we've been talking about all day is different careers, right? And so if these MBAs are thinking about their careers, let's say that they've been really intrigued by what you just said, and they're thinking, wow, I never thought I'd work in an association, but that's actually really interesting, representing a whole industry, having a board full of CEOs, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think it takes to be a successful association CEO these days?
Well, like Laura said when she opened her comments, I wish I had gotten my MBA. As I look at my job now, that would be the most practical thing to have had, to be able to better understand some of the things that my CEOs and my members are thinking about on a day-to-day basis. So you're already going to come with that skill set. I think what's unique about the association environment, and you have to understand this, is that you're the only ones that are paid. There could be hundreds of thousands of people in a given industry, the tech sector, healthcare, gaming, whatever it might be. The 20 people you work with, the 50 people you work with, you're the only people that are paid to look out for the industry. Everybody else is compensated to look out for the bottom line interests of their company. So the people I deal with at MGM are looking out for MGM, and the same true at Caesars and Scientific Games and everywhere else. Our job is to look out for the industry. So the most important thing from an association standpoint is to not get sucked into pushing the agenda of any one single company, but to be willing to be a leader in terms of what can help grow the industry. Our job at the association is to grow the pie. You guys fight it out for your share. Your companies will naturally try to pull you into what they know naturally, which is their best interests. Your job is to rise above that and see where those other opportunities might be. That is, I think, that's what gets me motivated in associations. I've worked in several. I love that opportunity. I love the access you have to the thought leaders in the industry. You're working with CEOs oftentimes, more often than people within their own companies are working with them. You're seeing that big picture thinking. Your job is to apply that in a different way. I think it's a tremendous challenge.
Jeff's so articulate, right? That you make it sound easy, because you use big words and you put them together in a nice way, so that sounds really easy. But what you're really saying is, you get into a room with people who are fight to the death competitors, right? Fight over every dollar, every 0.5% of market share, et cetera. And you got to get them to agree to move in lockstep. What skill does that take?
I think a skill that I'm still developing, first of all. The first thing to understand is know when you're not going to get alignment. There are a lot of issues where you're simply not going to be able to get people aligned. Don't waste your limited resources there. Don't waste your time there. There are enough things to focus on where you can generate that alignment. It happens through, I think, a couple things are critical to it. One, inclusivity. You have to have the right people around the table. You need to be getting the input from the right people. For a long time, and Suzanne used to see this, a lot of trade associations were clubs where they got the people they wanted around the table. You can't do that anymore. If you want to get an industry aligned, you have to be inclusive and make sure that all the voices are represented, number one. Number two, there has to be transparency. You can't try to hide the ball. You can't try to have your own agenda. There has to be a degree of transparency in terms of what the association's point of view is. And then there has to be, and this is the most painful thing, there has to be an exhaustive process to find where that alignment, where that consensus exists. And it takes months, it may take years. We're going to talk about an issue in a moment. It took us a good 18 months of rigorous internal discussions, bringing in economists, bringing in others to assess market potential, to assess risk. And you've got to invest that time. You can't rush to the outcome if you want to bring people along. If you try to rush to the outcome, and it certainly happened to me before, and you don't have that alignment, you're going to get out on a plank and you're going to look around when the media coverage isn't so favorable, when the criticisms arise, and you're going to see that you're out there by yourself. You've got to put the time in that rigorous consensus building process. And when you do, you can get to some great outcomes.
It is why having an MBA can be valuable in an association, because at the end of the day, some of the work Jeff just talked about, assessing risk, looking at future market potential, not only do you have to do that work and evaluate the work the outside consultants are doing, but then be able to talk that talk in the way the CEO can hear it when they come back into the room. So switching to, you just alluded to, as I said earlier, we've talked about the administration, we've talked about the Hill, but in the next couple of months, you're going to hear about a big decision with huge impacts on your industry. I'd love to hear you talk both about what this case is, what it means to your industry, and how you've been involved.
So go back to 2014, and anybody that turned a television on in 2014, there was one advertising campaign that you couldn't miss, and that was for daily fantasy sports. Every time you turned the TV on, no matter what it was DraftKings, it was FanDuel, it was people getting these big checks, all the winnings they could possibly have. And everybody that saw those ads saw them for what they were. It was sports betting. It was a new form of gambling. And most people that saw those ads asked themselves, why is that okay, but the other stuff isn't? And that's exactly what we as an industry asked ourselves. We've been living since 1992 with a federal law that bans sports betting outside Nevada. Nevada is the only state where you're allowed to do that in the traditional fashion. And yet these companies were out here promoting on television, telling you how to put your teams together and the millions of dollars you could win. It led us to ask ourselves, why is this happening? And are we comfortable with this status quo? And what we learned through that process is, one, of course we're not comfortable with the status quo. They're tapping into a customer that we would love to have as our customer, and we need to go change this environment. How do we make that happen? You know, for many years, Nevada thought it had a monopoly on sports betting. All of us would go out there for the Super Bowl or March Madness. But as we did our assessment, we learned well, Nevada didn't have a monopoly. There was $150 billion of illegal sports betting taking place in every other state around the country, and only $4.5 billion taking place in Nevada. So the opportunity here was to grow our business. That was a new way of looking at things. How do we tap into a market that we don't currently have? As we looked at the various ways we could do this, one through Congress, one was the most prominent, but another one through the courts. New Jersey, for many years, had been fighting what it thought was a discriminatory law that limited sports betting to Nevada. What we decided to do was get in and start working with New Jersey to support their efforts, to encourage lower courts to take a look at their case that thought that this ban was unconstitutional.
Now, I'm sorry to interrupt you, were the Nevada casinos mad at you at that point, or were they so happy to get a piece of the $150 billion illegal pie that you could talk them into going along?
So that was exactly the process, and that's what I was referencing before. You have to be willing to invest in that process. If you're MGM, Caesars, Las Vegas Sands, Wynn, you own the Las Vegas Strip. Why would you want to see sports betting somewhere else? That's the question they asked. And when we went through that exhaustive process, and when you realize that MGM and Caesars have dozens of properties elsewhere in the country, and when you're Las Vegas Sands and Wynn and realize, well, we don't have properties elsewhere, we know that as gaming has grown elsewhere, it has only strengthened Nevada. There's really no downside here. We're not going to cannibalize the market we have here in Nevada because so many people are doing this in an illegal fashion elsewhere, which led us to eventually encourage the Supreme Court after the lower courts had disagreed with New Jersey at every single turn. New Jersey did not win a single case, and it was Governor Chris Christie at the time fighting this effort, did not win a single case with the lower courts. But we urged the Supreme Court to take this on.
The Supreme Court of the United States.
The Supreme Court of the United States. We worked with 20 state attorneys general, states like Utah and Texas, which don't have gambling, but think the federal government has overreached in this area, to encourage the court to take a hard look at this, and the court agreed. And on December 4th of last year, the court held an hour-long hearing. If you've never had an opportunity to sit in on a Supreme Court hearing, I strongly encourage you to do so. I hadn't done it before. It is a remarkable education in the civics of our country. Phenomenal to watch the questions, the debate taking place. And anytime between now and June 30th, we're going to get a ruling that probably upends the way our nation has approached sports betting for the past 26 years. And in doing so, a multi-billion-dollar growth opportunity for the gaming industry, for sports leagues, for broadcasters, and many others.
But also, I'm extrapolating here, I'm assuming you take something from an illegal, the kind of undercover economy above ground, it'll increase tax revenue, employment opportunities. You know, it's good for the whole economy, is it not?
The beauty of this issue, well, years ago, when you've all seen it, there were a lot of critics of gambling. Gambling has gone mainstream now. As I said before, 40 states have casinos. There are only 2 states that don't have casinos or lotteries. In the case of Utah and Hawaii, there's gambling everywhere. It's crossed that threshold of being a mainstream industry. So those that can benefit from it now are much greater than those that might have benefited from it years ago. The key, and this is what we work on within an association, is as the court begins to get law out of the way and states want to expand and bring sports betting in, how do we ensure that they accompany that with really good policy? The state of Pennsylvania just put some underwriting legislation in place that has a minor 36% tax rate on sports betting, an industry where there's only about 5% profit. That's upside down. That's the type of policy now, as we're successful in the courts, that we need to effectively address from coast to coast.
So you're an association CEO, you're sitting on, this ticking time. How do you find out the Supreme Court's about to decide, or do you not until they issue the decision?
So that, the Supreme Court can make such significant differences in industries, obviously in our country, but in any business in which you go and enter. And it is the most opaque of all of the branches of government with which we deal. We don't know why the court decides to take a case or refuse to take a case. We don't know exactly when a ruling will come out other than when this deadline of June 30th is. It is a very opaque process. There are ways to inform it, but there are limited ways to influence it. So right now, everything we're doing is being prepared. We're not putting all of our eggs in one basket, We continue to work on Capitol Hill. We're prepared in the States. You've got to play both angles here. And it's something that any industry you go in will be affected at one point in time by what the Supreme Court does. And I think recognizing that you need to be prepared with any potential outcome is the key.
What interests me about this, right, so let's say you're representing this industry, and, you know, we're all hoping that Jeff has a big win that he's about to, you know, produce for his members in the next couple of weeks. There's a downside to having a big win when you're in the association industry, which is that you've been able to rally your members around something really big, and they're giving you resources and respect and time and attention and focus for doing that. Are you at all concerned that if there's a big win here, it's hard for your association to keep everybody united and as excited for the rest of your agenda, or is there enough that you're still fighting and promoting?
Well, so I think two things from that. One, a win is rarely clean. So even a win is going to create a lot of confusion, a lot of implementation, a lot of opportunities to inform how things roll out, number one. But number two, and this is the more important point, a win is what creates momentum. And I think what stalls so many industry associations is when you're playing defense year after year after year, and you're just trying to prevent bad things from happening in Washington, your industry loses enthusiasm really quick. You have kind of a lowest common denominator approach to what we can do. And you'll find that CEOs and other industry leaders begin to look at Washington as a place where they don't see it as a good use of their time. When you can begin to get some wins under your belt, when you can show what an industry can do when it works together, your engagement levels spike. Your interest in the association goes up. The desire among the members to begin to identify additional areas where we can put together proactive efforts to help grow the industry increases. So I think this will be, for us, this will be the steroid that allows us to find 3, 4, 5 new offensive opportunities. Will increase our membership, will increase participation, and will certainly increase enthusiasm.
Well, we're all rooting for you. Let me ask you to wrap up by giving I'd ask you to give 2 tips of advice to this group here. One is, if you could go back to just finishing school and launching your career, what advice would you give, you know, to young Jeff about what was about to happen, or these people here, about career launch and next steps?
The first thing that comes to mind is get as many diverse experiences as you can. In Washington, that's embraced. I'm not sure how, and this is where I've spent 20-some years, I'm not sure it's embraced everywhere. Obviously, our parents think it's crazy that we'll only work someplace for 3 years and we'll move on. I think as many diverse experiences as you can get is a positive. The exposure to different types of management, the exposure to different ways of doing things, and different ways of thinking is exactly the right way, I think, to build your resume. The other thing that comes to mind, I had a previous boss who his daughter was going out. She just had her bachelor's. She was going out and starting her first job, and she was complaining because they weren't giving her anything substantive to do. And I commented to him that, you know, your first job is all about learning how to set your alarm clock and show up to work on time. It's learning how to not be hungover, you know, more than 3 days a week. Right? Find that you are going to have bad experiences. I was at Freddie Mac in 2003 when an accounting scandal hit that eventually led to the 2008 recession. I was running a program where we were supposed to go out with members of Congress and do all these great events around the country. We became radioactive overnight. It was a bad experience. You're going to have bad experiences. What do you take from those experiences? How do you learn? In that instance, I tried to learn, how does this, you know, I forget how many employees we had, 12,000 employees. How does this big cargo ship turn when it needs to right now? What are the obstacles and the inefficiencies in this business that I'd like to see corrected? I think every experience you go into, good or bad, there are lessons you can take from that that will inform not just what you go and do in your next job, but will inform what you do as a leader. So much of the way we run AGA is built on things we saw in other organizations that we didn't like. And we said, let's do this different. So look for every opportunity to find the things that you would do different and apply those when you have that opportunity.
And last word about the impact of government on a company or on an industry.
It is I want to, the easy way to look at it is cost. We look at taxes, we look at regulation. I like to look at everything through that opportunity lens. What could government do if we got creative how we wanted to use them? Last story I'll tell, prior to this job, I was in the travel industry. In the travel industry, one of our biggest problems was the act of traveling for business travelers, for leisure travelers, was becoming a real pain. In fact, people were complaining about TSA day in, day out, why it was an obstacle to traveling. We asked ourselves, what could we do about that? How can we improve this? So we pulled the former Secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge, together with us. We pulled another 10 or so folks together to put a proposal on the table how you can improve this experience. And today we have the program we recommended, PreCheck. And for anybody who's enjoyed TSA PreCheck, you know that it makes a monumental difference in the travel experience. So what I would leave you with is government is an obstacle. Government is a challenge. But it is seeking ideas, it is seeking creativity, and there are ways to use your creative thinking to grow your business, to improve your customer's experience. Don't get bogged down in the obstacles. Get focused on some of the opportunities that you can create.
I think that was really fantastic, Jeff. Thank you very much. Really. I hope as you all leave here today, you'll take a couple of lessons with you. One is, as soon as you're the CEO of your own company, you should join your industry trade association and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Serious, well, that is serious, but really what I want you to take away is that free enterprise is really important. The ability of the private sector to create jobs is really important. It's important to freedom, it's important to opportunity, it's important to your families, it's important to your future, it's important to this country's future. And you own that responsibility. The people in this room own the responsibility to go out there and create opportunity and create jobs and do that for this country. And it's a serious responsibility. And if we've done anything today to help you be successful at that, then we've done a little bit of our job. And what we wanted to leave you with is that a government is part of that job. You know, I started today saying when I got my MBA, we spent a ton of time on strategy and finance and operations. And I'll tell you one quick anecdote as a closing thought. Taking an operations class at Georgetown, great professor. You know, it's all process, bottlenecks, da-da-da-da-da. And I said, look, for our team project, could we do a Washington example of how hard it is to get an ad approved, right? So we want to run an ad. What's the approval process through legal, through policy, through comms, et cetera, and use that as kind of as if it were a factory, as if we were producing a product. And the professor said to me, not only can you do that, but I'll help you with the grading, because I won't know how to grade it either. But if we as DC business schools don't get good at applying the old-time important curriculum to the business you're actually going to be in, then we're going to be obsolete. So I think there's a good chance that you're going to have careers in Washington and you'll need this stuff. But even if you don't, make sure you're hiring good government affairs people, make sure you're overseeing good government affairs people, and make sure you're looking for the opportunities that governments can provide, as well as what you need to defend your industry or your company against. And with that, I'll say good luck, stay in touch, come back and visit us, and thank you so much for being with us today.
I feel glorious.